Robert Wayne Cox was a 57-year-old from Havana, Arkansas. He built himself a log cabin home and liked to tinker around with old cars. On February 19th, 2011, he left his house to take a walk around his property. His wife saw him out there, but when she went to bring him back inside, Robert was gone. He was never seen again. I'm Ed Densel, and this is Unfound. Clear cut. Any adult who has used the English language for any length of time has used these words together. What do they mean? Sharply outlined, free from ambiguity or uncertainty. So says dictionary.com. To use the expression in a sentence, there is a clear-cut reason why everyone shouldn't listen to Nickelback. But there's another definition for clear-cut, and it's not an adjective. It's a noun. And I didn't know this despite me being raised in the hills of Pennsylvania around plenty of woods. Clear-cut can also mean an area of forest where all the trees have been cut down. Nope, never heard of it. I bring this up because today we have the disappearance of Robert Cox, who disappeared while walking around in a clear-cut. It was right beside his house. This is where his wife last saw him. But is this really what happened? You're going to get to hear all the facts. What was going on in Robert's life before he disappeared? You'll hear about the other people in his life. We'll discuss all the extensive searches done to find him. Then you'll have to decide, is this disappearance really so clear-cut? And now a summary of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Good's site, charlieproject.org. Robert Cox worked in the coal and gas industry, first in California, then back in his home state of Arkansas. He was on his second marriage at the time of his disappearance, but had a son, Brian, from his first. Yet he had been suffering with anxiety and depression for many years, and these conditions seemed to finally overtake him as he became paranoid and delusional in 2008. Medicine seemed to get him back on track, but Robert was never truly himself again. On top of that, in 2010, Robert developed physical issues, to the point that his chin rested against his chest, and he became unable to communicate. Under these conditions, Robert walked out of his home around noon on February 19, 2011. When his sister Lydia called, Robert's wife Vicky said he'd only been outside for a few minutes. After some prodding from Lydia, Vicky went outside and claimed she saw Robert out in an undeveloped parcel beside their house, an area full of cut-down trees and deep mud holes known as a clear-cut. But when Vicky drove over there in her car, she couldn't find Robert. A large search, including an airplane, started almost immediately, yet Robert was never seen again. Despite Vicky's compliance with police, the following issues continue to this day regarding Robert's disappearance. Number 1. How could someone in Robert's degraded physical condition walk through the clear-cut to the point that he escaped detection from searchers? Number 2. Statements from Vicky going back at least a few years regarding her attitude toward Robert's declining health. And number 3. Paperwork from a death certificate to an accident insurance policy that points to people who wanted to profit and move on from Robert's disappearance. Police continue to work the case, but there have been no new developments in recent years. Robert's family is split on what they believe happened to him. The guest for this episode is Lydia Carter, Robert's sister. Unfound News. Unfound's November newsletter went out yesterday. Did you get it? If not, make sure you get on the mailing list by emailing me privately. If you're wondering what's in it, you'll find a preview of upcoming cases, commentary on missing persons issues, and behind-the-scenes looks at things that are in the works. People seem to enjoy it. Next, I'm going to be doing some filming of me practicing for some presentations I hope to be doing on college campuses in 2019. One subject will be entrepreneurial reporting in the 21st century. The other will be, of course, missing persons cases. More theory than actually talking about specific cases, that is. I will be posting these practice sessions on YouTube in a few weeks. Please look for them. Finally, Unfound is making a push to get to 150 Patreon supporters by the end of the year. We have about 55 members to go. Are you a patron yet? If not, all it takes is 6.67 cents per day. Go to patreon.com/unfound podcast to contribute. Thanks. Where you can find Unfound. Unfound personally supports accounts on Podomatic, iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Contribute to Unfound at the previously mentioned patreon.com/unfound podcast. And new Patreon supporters this week are Lou, Stylianos, Emily, Christine, Stacy, Shelley, another Shelley, Kara, Callie, Marianne, Jamie, Penny, Heather, Jamie, and Jasmine. And at PayPal, unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. That is also the email address. And I need to thank Tobias for his contribution this past week. The websites, unfoundpodcast.com and triblive.com/news/unfound. Merchandise, the books at amazon.com in both ebook and print form. Don't forget the reviews. Shirts at myshopify.com/unfound-podcast. And cards at makeplayingcards.com/sell/unfound podcast. And please mention Unfound on all true crime websites and forums. Thank you. I'm so fortunate to have on this episode of Unfound the sister of Robert Wayne Cox, Lydia Carter. Lydia, welcome to Unfound.
Thank you, Edward.
Let's start here, as we always do on Unfound. Tell the listeners a little bit about your brother. How many, first of all, let's start here. How many brothers and sisters did you all have?
Well, there was 4 of us. Had an older half-sister. She recently passed away.
Oh, no.
We had a older, he was a little over a year older than Robert. He passed away in 2006.
Mm-hmm.
And Robert is 10 years older than me, and then there is me.
Okay. So there's 4. So you're the only one left. I'm sorry to hear that. Okay, so he was older than you by 10 years?
Yes.
Okay. And what kind of older brother was he growing up? Was he protective of you? How would you portray all of it?
Definitely. We were like big buddies always. I was closer to him than I was my other 2 siblings. My mom and dad, they used to go on vacations and take big vacations, and most of the time I would choose to stay behind with my brother. Of course, this was after he was an adult and married, and I would spend my summers and all my school holidays with my brother Robert.
Wow, it does sound like you 2 were close. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. What was Robert into as far as maybe as a young man, hobbies, sports, school, anything like that?
Well, he was always a worker. When we lived in California, he done refinery work. First it started out in like a coke refinery, kind of like coal, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
Then it went into oil refinery. Then in 1987, he moved back here to Arkansas, bought a small place, had a small house on it that wasn't completely finished, and he finished it off by adding logs to it. So he built him a big, nice log house.
Wow, neat.
Yeah.
Neat. And is that the house that he lived in until he disappeared?
Yes.
Okay, so that's that location. Okay.
And then he was very much into hot rods and NASCAR and football, and he liked restoring, antique vehicles and stuff, and either keeping them for a while or selling them off later, but that's what I like to do.
So he sounds like your standard type of guy. Likes cars, likes sports. Okay. All right, cool. Okay. Did not go to college or anything like that, just graduated from high school, or what did he do
Yep.
there?
Just graduated high school, went, into working, and I think he was married by the time he was about 19, 20, something like that, to his first wife.
Well, let's talk about that very quickly, because the woman in his life and the people in his life are going to play a part in this case. But let's talk about his first marriage. Who was it to? You don't need to use her last name, but
Right.
um, how long were they married, and did they have any children, etc.?
Um, I was about 11 when they married, I think. 10 or 11, somewhere along in there. They were married probably, I guess, well over 20 years. I can't really remember. It's been so
Okay.
long ago. And then they had a son together he was born in 1980,
Okay.
and they just had the one son. And they had a little separation issue after my brother's son Brian was born. They got back together, and then they moved back here to Arkansas in 1987.
Okay. And when did they end up getting divorced? Roughly.
Shortly after, I'm going to say maybe right around 88, 89.
Okay. All right, so they were together maybe 8 or 9 years after his son was born. His son's name is Brian? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
Brian. Okay. So he was born in 1980, so he's roughly 10 years younger than I am now. And so he was born, though, I guess, like you said, did you say in California, out west?
Yes.
All right, and then they moved back and moved into the house that you talked about that became this log cabin type of
Yes.
house that he disappeared from. Okay, so they were there. They got divorced. I guess Robert stayed in the house, and his ex-wife moved out.
Right.
Okay. And so he lived there from 87 until he disappeared in 2011. But he did end up getting married again, and her name is Vicky. How did they meet? And what year did they get married? How did you feel about that? Him getting married again, etc. What can you tell the listeners about that?
Yes. He met Vicky, I'm going to say somewhere along 91, 92, best I can remember.
Okay.
Or it might have even been 90, I'm not sure. Anyways, she told me that they met. She had put an ad in the newspaper. I guess they used to have a singles column in the newspaper.
Way back in the day, yes.
Yeah, so she put an ad in there looking for a man. Well, my brother worked for the county road department here at that time. He was road foreman, and the guys at work seen that ad, so they were razzing my brother, giving him a hard time about it. So on a dare, they told him to call and go on a date. So eventually he did, and they went on their date, and then they clicked, and then she moved in with him. She was living in Russellville, which is about 25 to 30 miles, depending on where you live in Russellville, all the way out here. And they lived together for about a year. I remember coming out here, don't remember what year it was, probably 92, 93, I'm going to say. I came back to visit my mom and dad and my brother, of course. And I would come in the summertime, and I usually stayed about, 3-4 weeks at a time. And the first time I met her, we were sitting here at my parents' house on the porch swing, and we were talking, and she was telling me, how crazy she was about my brother, and, she was just all into him. And I told her, I said, well, I appreciate that, and I like all of that and what you're saying. I said, but I just want to make one thing clear. I said, me and my brother are very close, and me and his ex-wife, Deborah, she was always jealous of mine and my brother's relationship. So there was always static on her part, not mine, about mine and my brother's relationship.
On Deborah's.
So
let's make clear.
yes,
on Deborah, the ex-wife. Yes, Deborah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I said, I just want to maintain my relationship with my brother and, all of that. I don't want any static. And we just talked, and then once I moved back here in 95, then it's like me and her, we just became best friends. We did everything together.
So it was a little opposite from Robert's first wife.
Oh, yes, night and day.
Okay. And how far did you live from where Robert and Vicky and I guess Brian as well, where they lived? How far?
2 miles.
Very close. And so you saw him, would you say quite often, maybe once a week? Did you guys get together for
every day?
Almost every day. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so they got married in the early 90s. You moved back in 1995, and from there, everything was good. You got to know Vicky very well, and it sounds pretty good. And in the meantime, Robert was working. Did Vicky have a job?
Yes, back then she was a supervisor for Levi Strauss, and she had been for nearly 20 years, I guess. The plant shut down, and it moved out and went to, I don't know, Mexico or somewhere. So she was given, a payout by Levi Strauss. She took, I don't know, a year or two off, and then she went to beauty school and became a beautician.
Okay, and that's what she was doing when Robert disappeared later?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, this is also going to be playing a very prominent part in this disappearance, and this is Robert's physical problems, and I just want to touch upon them very quickly, and we'll get into depth here in a moment. But once again, to your recollection, you said you're seeing him almost every day. When would you say that you started noticing maybe that he was having some physical issues that you were maybe a little worried about? This is on top, maybe he had the flu once in a while, but something that you thought, I don't know if this is going to be going away. How do you remember that?
Well, I'm not sure about the going away part, but I know that in the latter part of 2008, my dad would mention to me that, he's seen a change in my brother. At that point in time, I had just started a new job, and I was working, part-time from home, and a couple of days a week I'd have to go in and work at the office and stuff. And so my dad would mention to me, that he felt like there was something going on. And the only thing that I could determine on my own by what was going on is it seems like depression and anxiety, which back in the late 80s, when him and his first wife, Deborah, were divorcing, he had an episode of anxiety and depression issues because of what was going on in that marriage and stuff, and just, the stress. He just moved here, just built his dream house, and then all that's going on. So then my mom was here and still alive then, so my mom was, seeing to him, taking him to doctors, trying to find out what was wrong. Panic anxiety wasn't a big known thing then like it is now, but that's what it was. So he got on meds, he got straightened out, everything was fine. So in 2008, he started kind of having similar symptoms. And I just told my dad, he had lost his job in the latter part of 2008. He was working for a friend, Chad, who had a kind of a construction little company. It was just him and my brother, but he had dozers and stuff, and they would go in and build logging roads for these logging companies on government land so the trucks could get in and the logging equipment could get in to harvest the trees. So that's when we started noticing a difference, is when that job ended. Chad had to shut down because the economy was going downhill. Gas and fuel prices went sky high. So he had to shut down. He couldn't afford to pay a wage plus, run his business. So he had to let my brother go. And so that was kind of the start of the decline. And I think just being a man, not having a job, and nothing really, we live very rural, so we don't have a whole lot of options, especially
Right.
when you're 50-something years old, to start a career over.
Sure.
So I just think that, and then Vicky's daughter had moved here at some point, her daughter and granddaughter, and I know they lived with them, and I can't remember what time period it was that they actually lived in the house with Robert and Vicky, and for how long. But I remember, they lived there for a while until Vicky got her daughter out and into an apartment in Russellville.
And how many, just to be clear, she does have a daughter. How many children does Vicky have? And I guess this is from a prior relationship, prior marriage?
Yes. From her first marriage, she has a son, Carl, and a daughter, Angela, and then a granddaughter, Shelby.
Okay. And Angela came at some point to live with Robert and Vicky. I'm going to guess maybe Brian was out of the house by this time, maybe in the 2000s, maybe?
Oh, yeah. Brian was married. He married in 2006, I believe.
Okay. So maybe that was a little stressful for Robert having Vicky's daughter there, maybe, along with her daughter, Shelby.
Yeah, I mean, my brother loved kids. I mean, that was never an issue, and, he was always very, very good to kids. Kids just magnetized to him. But Angela, was just kind of on the lazy side, I guess you could say. I don't know how else to put it.
Okay.
And just different. I'll put it that way.
Okay. We'll just leave it at that. You have mentioned that your father was seeing Robert. We should mention that that your father lives on the same property at Robert. In fact, they live like within 100 or 200, 300 feet of each other.
Right, exactly.
And your father is still alive to this day, 2018.
Yes, soon to be 91.
Wow. Okay. Well, we should all be so fortunate. So at the time of this disappearance, he would have been approximately 83 years old. And so you live 2 miles away, but your father, Robert's father, lives right there.
Right.
I think you told me at one point 150 to 200 feet away from Robert's house.
Yes.
Okay. So during these health, depression, anxiety that he was suffering, what was Vicky saying? You were very close to her, as you said. What was she saying about all this?
Well, after her daughter came into the picture and moved here, we didn't really see a whole lot of each other. It was mainly, phone conversations and, things like that. Sometimes I'd meet up with her for lunch if I was in town working. But I'm going to say somewheres in 2008, our relationship started waning. Not that we weren't getting along, just she was busy in her life. I was busy in my life. Things just change. It just happens.
All right. Now, there was something else that went on during 2008, and it could be a factor of this depression and anxiety. Did Robert, and we want to say for the record that there's no proof of this, at least as far as we know, at least at the time. But was Robert suspicious that Vicky was cheating on him?
Yes, that was a very strange thing. He got on this kick that he felt like she was seeing somebody else. And at the time, I told him, I said, "You're crazy." I said, "When does she have time? She's working and she's with her kids. She would go and see her son. Her son lived in Russellville. He's married. He had a child at that time, a young son that my brother just absolutely adored. And, she spent a lot of time over there around her family. Her family is pretty close-knit. And, it just went on for several months that he was on this kick, and I could see where it was, really bothering her. And I didn't really know anything about it until it started getting really bad. She never said anything to me. She never said anything to my dad. My brother never said anything to me, but my dad started telling me about my brother thinking that she was doing something.
And we want to say, once again, for the record, there's no proof that was going on.
Right, exactly.
Right? Okay,
No
this is probably something that was maybe just a factor of Robert's anxiety or the medication. We just don't know. But there's to this day, 10 years later, no proof, at least at that time, that she was doing anything behind Robert's back. I want to state that for the record. So, what was the conclusion of this? Did this continue for a while and it ended? What went on?
Yeah, it continued for quite some time, and then it was before Thanksgiving of '08. My husband and I had been to town grocery shopping, getting ready for the Thanksgiving dinner. We were driving home. I get a phone call from my nephew Brian, and he said, "Hey," he said, "Dad's lost it. He's called me and Carl out to the house, and he was saying that he knows that Vicky's been messing around on him. He's got proof." He said, "We get together, we drive out to the house." Vicky was there as well, I think. Maybe she hadn't come home from work, I think. He had the boys there. He was on the computer, said he opened up her email and said that there was all these dating site things in there. But they said that it was just like dating site advertisement.
Like spam.
Yeah,
right.
And he had printed all of that off.
Yeah.
So they said, "We need to meet with you and talk to you." And I said, "Well, where at?" And he says, "Well, meet us at Spring Creek Church, which is not far from either of our houses." And I said, "Okay, we'll be there in, 15, 20 minutes, whatever." So me and my husband, we get there, and they're standing outside of their car.
And when you say they, just to make sure, who was there? Who was everybody that was there?
Vicky, Brian, and Carl, her son and my brother's son.
Okay.
And Vicky.
Okay.
So we get out, and they start telling me, he's lost it. He thinks she's messing around. He's got all this stuff printed off. There's nothing to it. They said, "You're the only one that can talk to him, get through to him. We need to see if we can get him to the doctor or something, or to ER, because I guess he was just very anxiety-ridden." And Vicky said, "I'm just done. I just want out. I just want my stuff. I don't want anything else. I just want out. I'm just done."
Wow.
And I said, let's hold on. I said, let's not jump to conclusions here. I said, let's find out what's going on first. I'm not sure where she went. I don't know if they just hung out there for a little bit, but I said, okay, I'll drop my groceries off and then I'll go up there. So in the meantime, I'm calling my dad, telling him what's going on. And I told my dad, I said, I'm going to go up to the house, talk to him, see what's going on. And when I drove in up there, he was outside and he was pacing. And he kept telling me that his head was hot. And he was kind of holding his head. And I said, well, let's go in because it's November. And I said, well, let's go in. So we go in, we sit down, and, I could tell, he was very, the anxiety was just high. And I said, well, let's sit down. And I said, let's talk. And so I said, let's check your blood pressure because, with anxiety, your blood pressure always soars because I suffer from anxiety from time to time myself. Who doesn't anymore? But anyway, so his blood pressure was, a little elevated. So that was my door to say, hey, let's run to the hospital, get you checked out, just make sure, you're not having something going on here. And, of course, he didn't want to go. And I said, look, you're all I have left. I said, we've already lost Rodney, our older brother. I said, let's just go get checked out. I said, no big deal. So we go. I called my dad, and I said, okay, he wants to go. So my dad brought his truck up there. We got him in the truck. We went to a local hospital at Dardanelle, and, they run blood. They checked his blood pressure and all that. And they also done a CT scan because they wanted to see if he had had a stroke. So the CT scan didn't show a stroke or, anything strange going on. They put him on some blood pressure meds, and I'm pretty sure probably something for the anxiety. I can't really remember, but I'm sure they did. But while we were there, Vicky and Brian showed up. And then when they took him in the back to draw blood and stuff, Brian went back there with him, and Brian stayed back there in the back while they were doing whatever they were doing. He was with his dad. So when he come out, then he got in the car and he went home with Vicky, and we come home. And then, he would do okay, for a week or two, maybe a few days, and then, the anxiety part just never went away. It just increasingly got worse no matter what he was on.
No control, seemingly no control over it. And do you happen to believe, I know you weren't there, do you think he was taking his medicine like he should? Do you think Vicky was making him sure that he did that? Are we sure that this wasn't just getting worse because he was blowing off his medication, as a lot of people do who have these conditions?
Right. Yes. Well, as best as I could tell at that point in time, yes, she was making sure that he was taking his medication. She would even make him open up his mouth and make sure he was swallowing it.
Okay.
And so that part I do know. And, I know from being an anxiety sufferer myself, not always the first medication or 2 or 3 you're put on will, mellow you out and bring you to where you need to be. Sometimes it takes time for them to kick in. You got to find the right one. So anyways, he used to wear Wrangler jeans all the time, and they have a really thick seam on the outside of the legs. He would sit and put his fingernails under the edge of the seams on his jeans, and he would just rub back and forth to the point to where he shredded over time. He would shred those seams on the sides of his jeans, on the thighs. And, then he got to where he was always very outdoorsy. He was always working on something, piddling outside, just always doing something. And then he just got to where he would be shut up in the house in the middle of the day. The blinds would be pulled. It'd be dark, and he'd just be laying on the couch watching TV, which I thought was very strange. So,
which could be a factor of the medication. Could be. Sometimes that medication, not that I've experienced with it, but I do know that it can kind of make you feel very blah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we struggled with that. So then when I was home, I would go either up to his house and we would find something to do outside, or I would bring him down here to my house because we have a farm, so I would have him help me do chores. I'd help him with his firewood, and I'd get him to help me with my firewood. Just something to keep him active, keep his mind occupied, and he would do fine. I would cook him lunch, or we'd go grab a bite somewhere or something, just something to get him out and about so that he's just not cooped up in the house all the time because Vicky was working.
Okay.
So it just, continued to escalate.
Okay.
Into what? I don't know. To this day, I still don't know.
Right. And what was Vicky saying this time when you would be over there? I mean, once again, you had stated in late 2008 that when you had this meeting that she was ready to get out. Maybe she was stressed herself. Maybe she was having her own share of anxiety, which I think is understandable. But once 2009 came around, and like you said, he was staying inside a lot and everything, what was she doing? What was she saying when you talked to her?
Well, she was still working, and which she had to because she was the only source of income at that time. And they had no, medical insurance or anything because she was a hairdresser.
Mm-hmm.
So then I think she may have took him to the doctor a time or two in Russellville to somebody she knew, and they tried, different anxiety meds. He was put on Zoloft at one point, and we think that was causing him to hallucinate.
Right. You told me about the hallucination. Sure. He said he saw your deceased mother. Right.
Yes. There was a time where he said he saw our mom sitting in my dad's car because, it's only a couple of 100 feet from his house to my dad's house. And he would say that he would see our deceased brother. He would look out into the pasture, and he would say that he, would see a bear or a lion or, something like that. So we finally
No
figured
lions in
out.
Arkansas, Lydia? No lions in
No,
Arkansas?
no, we
Okay.
don't have any lions here.
Okay.
So we come to the determination it had to be medication. So went back to the doctor, took him off of, like I say, I believe it was the Zoloft, and all of that stopped.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was put on some stronger stuff, can't remember the name of it. And then he started getting it was like he was in slow motion. And then he would drool on himself. And then, the slightest little thing, he would laugh. So after a while, she would keep him on that because that kept him the calmest, but he couldn't hardly function on it. So me and my dad were like, cut it in half, give him half dose or something, he's just too out of it. So that was a struggle with her, getting her to back off on that. And then eventually, when I started taking him to my doctor, she took him completely off of it and put him on something else, some other anxiety med, and something like similar to Valium. There's different families of Valium, so she put him on something to help calm him that way too, and to help him sleep at night because he wasn't sleeping well. He would just pace, constantly pace from one room to the next, or he'd go outside and he would just pace around the house or in the yard, or he'd walk from his house to my dad's house, just back and forth, just pacing. So when we got to that point, it was hard to get her to give him the meds that he needed at night so that they could both sleep and get some rest. So that was a struggle.
So if I could just sum this up, it sounds to me around the time that maybe it was maybe soon after he lost his job. We don't know if this was going to, maybe if we would even had that job, maybe these things would have started anyway. We don't know, but we does have a history of this going back to the late 80s, early 90s, as you stated, when you said that your mother, when she was still alive, would take him to the doctor to handle some of these things.
Right.
And it just seems to me, my perception, I'm no expert, it seems that the doctors really didn't know what to do. It doesn't seem to me like any medication was getting him back to the old Robert. That's my perception.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
so he'd be very anxiety ridden, pacing around, tearing in his jeans, or he'd be very blah, just sitting at home inside, just watching TV. It's like
Right.
there was no happy medium between all of that. That's my perception. Right. Okay. Now so we know that something was going on there, and then of course there was this paranoia about Vicky cheating on him. There's no proof of that, and then the hallucinations. But probably the part of this that is even a bigger deal, maybe, to this disappearance is actually the physical change that he ended up undergoing as well. So you're struggling with these mental issues, trying to get this
Right.
prescription and the medicine right. When did the physical changes start?
The physical changes started about mid 2010. September 28th of 2010, I remember that because it's his birthday.
Mm-hmm.
They had been to Russellville, her and Robert, and she had gone over and had a portrait picture done of them two together. Of course, he was already struggling with the eating aspect. Like he would start to eat, and then it's like he would get choked up or something. And I know that can be brought on by anxiety because I did that as well when I had anxiety several years ago. You go to eat, and it just felt like your food was getting stacked up in your throat. So I just took it upon that it was that, because he'd already been checked out, and there was no determination that he had had a stroke or anything. So, I'm thinking in my head it's, related to the anxiety and stuff. So from September of 2010 to November of 2010, his neck, his head started dropping, but it wasn't completely dropped. It just looked very uncomfortable. Like you could see the tension in his muscles, in his neck, at the back of his neck. He started getting to where, he wouldn't talk very much. He was becoming nonverbal and really struggling with eating, solid food. So by Christmas of 2010, his head was completely dropped. His chin was resting on his chest. Couldn't, eat whole foods or anything by then. So between Thanksgiving and Christmas, that's when I started pureeing the food and taking it up there, and so he would have something to eat. My dad went and bought Ensure. We started giving him Ensure. He could suck on a straw and have Ensure. That way he's getting nutrition. So
when you started noticing this head dropping, did Vicky take him to the doctor? Was there any, at this point, once again, be maybe between September and let's say the end of November, did a doctor take a look at him? Was this some sort of disease or something like that? Or did you ever get any diagnosis for this?
Well, actually, I need to back up just a tad.
Okay.
I forgot the important. In September of 2008, going through all of this, him thinking that she was cheating on him or whatever. In September of 2008, she made an appointment with a neurologist, Dr. Oberlander, because she kept telling me and my dad, I just know he has dementia. He's got dementia just like his mom did. She always said and told everyone that my mother had dementia, which my mother did not. We never had confirmation from any doctor that she had dementia. My mom suffered from strokes, what they call TIAs, where you have little strokes. Sometimes you can have them all day long. Sometimes you may not have one for a week, a month, or whatever. But, my mom started suffering from strokes in the early 90s to the mid-90s. So she has this MRI done on Robert in September of 2008. She calls me at work one day. She says, hey, I got some good news. And I said, what's that? And she said, I got the report back from the MRI. There is no signs of dementia. And I said, that's great. I didn't think there would be. So then in 2009, as he progressively is getting worse as far as
mental,
the mental aspect, and thinking that she's, this went on for a year, that he was thinking that she was seeing someone else. So in 2009, I start taking him to Counseling Associates, which is a counseling facility in Russellville, just trying to see if, we can get something pulled out, if they can figure out what's going on with him. Of course, they're not medical doctors. So their guess was, he could be, suffering from schizophrenia. It could be some form of dementia. They didn't know either. So I take him back to my doctor, who's a nurse practitioner, in 2009, and she says, well, it could be a form of early onset dementia. She said, we'll send him to a specialist, Dr. Lou in Little Rock, who specializes in early onset dementia. We go see Dr. Lou. I'm thinking the end of 2009. Well, actually, before Dr. Lou, I put him in the psych ward. That was really hard to do. That's what the Counseling Associates recommended, was to put him in the psych ward at St. Vincent's in Little Rock to do an evaluation to see if they could determine anything. I had to come up with a plan for that. Got with my nephew, his son Brian. I said, look, they're thinking we need to put him in psych care for a few days, run him through some tests, see if they can figure something out. But I can't do it just by myself. I'm going to need your help. So we come up with this plan that, we're going to take him to this place where he's going to talk to this detective. We're going to get this detective to follow Vicky. He needs to tell him what they need to know so they can find out if she is, in fact, cheating on him, whatever. So call Vicki at work. I tell her what's going on. I said, you need to come home because we got to take him to Little Rock. So me, Vicki, and Brian take my brother down to Little Rock, go to the St. Vincent's Hospital. We're in the psych area. I had no idea how this worked. So we're waiting like in this hallway area, and it just has big double doors. There's not a soul around, and they said, wait there. So this nurse comes out, opens the big double doors, and she said, is Robert Cox here? We say, yeah. She says, okay, come with me. So we start to follow behind the double doors, and she's like, oh, no family allowed. She says, you won't see him for a couple of days, and the door's shut. And I'm like, crap, really? Because I had no idea how it worked. So he was there for, I don't know, 2 nights, a couple of days and a couple of nights. We went down the following night, Vicki and I did, and then Brian and his wife Becca, they met us there, so we all got to go in to visit with him, and boy, was he mad at me. It was like, why did you do this to me? Why did you put me in here? There's nothing wrong with me. And it was like the most sanest time that he had been in. And so I guess while he was in there, he got to call Vicki a couple of times before we went to pick him up, and he got to come home. So me and Vicki went and picked him up. We stopped and had lunch. We come home. Things are good for a little while. We get the report back from the doctor. And by the way, I have all of his doctor's reports except for the one from Dr. Oberlander. I could not ever get that report. But anyways, the report said, when we picked him up, they're like, we don't even know why he was here. There's nothing wrong with him. So whatever testing and questions they put him through, apparently he passed with flying colors. So that was very strange.
And that was in 2009.
Yes.
Okay. So you had this determination that he didn't have dementia. These people tell you they don't even understand why he was in the psych ward. He just seems to be having these episodes of mania and anxiety, depression all over the place, and the medication just doesn't get it right. But the physical issues, I think, are the most important part to this disappearance because of what the belief is that he just walked away. Could you explain to the listeners the kind of physical issues that Robert was having in late 2010?
Okay, so from around September of 2010, that's when he started going nonverbal. Then from November to December of 2010, his head completely drops to his chest. That's where he starts really having the problems eating and all of that.
Okay. And during this time, did Vicki or you take him to the doctor to try to figure out why his head was dropping like that? And in fact, he started to shuffle, I guess, a little bit. His walking had changed as well. Any doctor's appointments that determined any of that?
No, not really. I mean, there was never a documented, I don't know the exact word I'm looking for. There was never any documentation from any specific doctor that he, in fact, had dementia or, anything else. That was never, concrete what his problem was. The head dropping, of course, he's losing weight, balance issues, couldn't feed himself, dress himself, couldn't brush his teeth, comb his hair, the whole thing. Went into, having to wear adult briefs, He just wasn't able to take care of himself. Eventually got to where getting in and out of the car was an issue. He had to have help, getting his feet in and, to lift his feet in to get in the car.
And once again, during this time, when his head started to drop, he could still talk. Was he saying anything to you at this point? Or to Vicki, anybody that you trust, that, why is my head dropping? What's going on here? Did you ever say anything?
No. from 2010, from September of 2010 to December, he was completely nonverbal.
Wow. Okay.
That fast. Within 2.5 months, nonverbal.
Okay. And once again, did any doctor look at his neck to figure out why this was happening?
Well, again, going to some of them, or they suspected, one doctor suspected, what is it called, where you get the tremors, Michael J. Fox.
Parkinson's disease?
Parkinson's disease.
Mm-hmm.
That was brought up, and, like I said, the dementia thing, but, there was never any further testing done to determine that, and then he disappeared.
Okay. All right, so just for the record, before he disappeared, there was never any diagnosis as to why this healthy guy, yes, he was having some mental issues going on that he had been fighting maybe for a couple years, but he was able to walk around and go outside, and to the point where I guess he was trying to follow Vicky around, but then suddenly he became pretty much physically immobile.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe he could just shuffle around.
He walked, but he would always pick and choose where he walked. Like, my dad kept a path mode from his house to my dad's house so that he had good level ground to see where he walked, because here at my house, on one side of my house, I have some trees that have tree roots that are on top of the ground. And he would be outside walking, but he would never go down that one side of my house because he knew he couldn't navigate that uneven ground.
Right.
So he knew what his limits were on where he could walk and what he could do.
Okay, so even though he was nonverbal, and you and I had a conversation, in fact, a follow-up conversation where I asked you, he couldn't talk because of his head being down on his chest. I asked you if he could even write with a pencil and a piece of paper. You said he couldn't even do that.
I never tried, but probably not.
Okay, but is it your belief in being around him that he still had his mind? He knew what reality was.
Yes, I firmly believe that.
Okay. All right. So he wasn't, we talked about some hallucinations, but we believe that was brought on by the drugs, but he still knew what was going on. He might have had complex ideas in his head about things, but he just couldn't express them because he couldn't talk, and then he didn't have the ability to write on a piece of paper.
Right, because he still recognized people. He knew who, everybody was. You could tell because, he would smile, his face would just light up. He would stick his hand out to shake, if he's seen a neighbor or something come to his house or out for a drive or something, and you see a neighbor, he'd always stick his hand out and shake their hand. He didn't do that just to anybody, but just to people that he knew. So, yes, I truly believe he was still in there.
All right, so this happened very quickly, like you said, from approximately September 2010. Let's just pick a month, June 2010. He was talking. He was walking around regularly. That then starts in September, and by the end of the year, he's a totally different person. Okay, yes. Okay. What is Vicky saying this time? You're seeing her. What is she saying about all this?
Well, really not a whole lot. I know that she was really stressed out. Your husband is kind of, basically disappearing before your eyes. But, she just never really seemed concerned, about finding out what the true problem was with him. She just had it in her head that he had dementia and you wasn't going to change that. She was just ready to just live with that's what it is. She just, to me, and to my dad, my husband, and other people that knew the situation, she just didn't seem to care and didn't seem to be that interested in wanting to take care of him, like he should be taken care of.
And you told me one instance of going to the doctor maybe before these dropped head started, is that you were at the doctor, and after the consultation afterwards, You're sitting there talking to the doctor, Robert's there, and then Vicky went on the opposite side of the room. Just totally took herself out of the conversation.
Yes, that's when we went to Dr. Lou, who was the dementia specialist,
Okay.
and he was explaining what it could be, that it could be a type of dementia, but that he would have to have a PET scan done, and those are like $4,000 or $5,000 if you don't have insurance. Of course, they didn't have insurance, but yeah, he's talking to me and my brother. She's on the other side of the room. She didn't even come over, engage, ask questions, or anything really. So I told her, I said, well, we need to get after we left the doctor's office, I said, well, we need to get this test done. She said, we can't afford it. And I said, well, I'm going to talk to Dad when we get home. Talked to my dad, told him what happened. He says, I got the cash on hand, set up the appointment. We got to know what's wrong with him. We got to help him. We got to do what we can do. Told Vicki what my dad said. She said, I don't want to borrow the money. I don't want to do that, whatever. And I said, you don't have to pay it back. It's not about that. It's about finding out what's wrong with Robert and getting him the help that he needs. So I went on ahead and scheduled that follow-up appointment to get the PET scan done the day before we were to go, which I think was in February of, I don't know what year. Anyways, set it up. The day before we were to go, we were having some bad weather here. I think maybe some snow might have been coming in. So I called her at work and I said, hey, what time do you want to leave in the morning in case there's bad weather to get to that appointment? She said, I called and canceled it. We're not going. And I said, why would you do that? And she said, because I don't want your dad paying for it. And I said, it doesn't matter who pays for it. It's about getting him help and finding out what's wrong and what's going on. And she said, well, when I get his disability, she said, I'll go ahead and have the scan done. And I said, that could be 6 months to a year before he gets disability because it's not anything that happens overnight. So anyways, she canceled the appointment, and he never got his PET scan.
And that would have been maybe February 2010, a full year before he disappeared, probably. It certainly wasn't in February of 2011. This was maybe 2010.
Yes.
Okay. How was Robert's son Brian acting during all this?
Well, they always had a good, close relationship, but when his dad started having issues, he just kind of, I don't want to say disappeared, but he just wasn't around very much.
Okay, even though he lived in the area?
Yes, he worked right here in town where we live, about 10 miles from us. He has a lunch break, but, he never come out and spent time with his dad or anything like that. He just, which I know guys are different, when it comes to stuff like this. I get it. They're just not, and I'm not saying all guys, but a lot of guys, they don't know how to deal with stuff like that. So I can chalk some of it up to that. But, it's still your dad. No matter how you look at it, it's still your dad. But, yeah, he wasn't very involved.
Okay. At what point during all of this, and this is going to play a role later, what point did you get power of attorney for your brother Robert?
Well, I didn't get it. My brother got it. That was in September of 2009, I believe. He was still driving, still had, good faculties at that point. And he had been talking to my dad about it because he told my dad, he says, if something happens to me, I don't think Vicky's going to take care of me. And, I don't want to be thrown in a nursing home or anything like that. So my dad told him, he said, well, you might want to talk to your sister about that because I'm getting old. I may not live that long, So he never even come to me and talked about it. He just calls me one day and he says, hey, I need you to meet me down here in town. I got a power of attorney. So I leave and I go down there, and he's got this power of attorney drawn up to where, it covered like his medical issues and stuff like that. There was nothing on there checked for life insurance policies or anything like that because he didn't believe in that stuff. So it was mostly finances and medical stuff.
Mm-hmm. All right, so he chose you. I mean, I know your sister. You've been his sister your entire life.
Yeah.
You've been his sister your entire life, but he'd been married to Vicky. Let's say at this point, let's say 15 years, and he still chose you over her.
Mhm. Yes.
Okay, and Vicky didn't know this at the time, did she?
No.
Okay, she didn't find this out till later.
Not
Okay.
that I'm aware of, because I'm sure if she would have known or if he would have told her, it would have been it would have turned into something, I'm sure.
Okay, of course. All right, so by the end of 2010, Robert is having some serious physical issues. He's shuffling around. He can't communicate. Seems like his mind is still there, but he doesn't have a way to get the thoughts out, it seems. And this continues into 2011, pretty much the same things going on. You don't have a complete diagnosis of these. Maybe you have a diagnosis for the mental issues that he had started in maybe 2008, but the physical stuff seems to be still unexplained. You get to February 2011, which is the month in which he disappeared. And do you remember the last time you saw your brother Robert?
I do.
Tell us about it.
It was on a Wednesday, and I believe that would have been the 16th. I had just got home from work, and I was outside doing some chores, and Vicky pulled in the yard in the car, and her and Robert was in the car, and I helped him get out of the car, and we walked to my barn because I was feeding horses and dogs and stuff, and I was carrying on with him like I always did. Of course, there's no verbalization back from him, but he's smiling and stuff. And they stayed here and visited for a few minutes, and then they left. And then I don't know why I didn't see him on Thursday. And I could have, and I just don't remember, because a lot of times when I was working from home, I might go up there at like 10 o'clock at night. Or I may run up and drop their dinner off and then come back home and work. So it's possible I could have seen him on Thursday, but Thursday I don't remember. I know I didn't see him Friday, the 18th, because my husband and I had gone to town and we didn't get back till late. But I always talk to her daily on the phone, several times a day, checking on him, make sure everything's okay, whatever.
Sure.
But my dad seen him Friday evening around 6 o'clock Friday evening. My dad went up there to the house, but she didn't invite my dad in. I think when my dad was at the door, I think he told me, she said, "Well, we're having shrimp for dinner. I know you don't like that." And then they had conversation. He said he remembered seeing my brother standing there, and then he walked off. He was standing behind Vicky and her daughter, Angela, and then he said it looked like he had a bowl or something in his hand and like he was eating something with his fingers, maybe.
Okay. To your knowledge and maybe to your father's memory, had he ever been denied to go into the house ever before when he had just walked over there? Is that common, or would you say that's something that's unusual?
That was very unusual, because that was the first thing my dad said, is he was not invited in the house. She didn't say, "Well, come on in," or anything like that. They just stood at the door and talked.
Okay. And we have to remember, once again, your father is 83 at this time approximately, and he only lives less than 200 feet away from door to door. Not very far.
Right.
And they still don't let him come inside. They kind of talk on the porch, and then they turn him away, and that was that. And that would have been, like you said, around 6 in the evening.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so let's then move to Saturday, February 19th, 2011. My understanding is that after your father went over there, he went home. What time approximately does your father maybe go to bed?
Usually, it varies, but typically not Not before midnight, very rarely before midnight.
Okay.
And then, sometimes he's up and down all through the night, too. It just depends.
Okay. And would you say that where maybe he sits in his house and he's by himself there? He's by
Yes.
himself? Okay. And if somebody were to pull up in the driveway to Robert's house 200 feet away with their headlights on, is that something that your father would notice if he's just hanging out at home? What do you
It would
think?
depend. If he had his blinds open, yes, he would see the headlights come in because the way the driveway is shaped and where my dad's house sits, headlights will shine through.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it depends on if he would have his door opened or closed, if he would hear a vehicle come in or hear, any kind of commotion.
Okay.
So it would just depend on where he was at, in his house at that point in time.
Okay. Let's move to once again to the next day, February 19th, 2011. If you could, how does Vicky explain what happened that morning? What was she doing? Of course, her daughter was there. Her granddaughter Shelby was there. What do they say was going on that morning that led up then to Robert disappearing? Their story.
As far as I know, their story is they got up that morning and went through their morning routine of, I don't know, eating donuts or whatever. And at some point, her daughter and her granddaughter were there. They had stayed the night that Friday night. They got up, they were doing their laundry. They always done their laundry on the weekends at Robert and Vicky's house. She claims that he went outside. He'd been tugging on her arm, wanting to go for a car ride. Her daughter was painting her toenails. The granddaughter was outside, I believe, riding on the quad or doing something. And when I made the call up there, that's when she claims that she's seen him in the clear cut, and that's what set everything into motion was when I called up there.
Okay. Now you told me that you usually called there at maybe 9:30 in the morning, but you were delayed this morning. Can you explain that? What time this
Yes.
was?
It was just, when I think back, it was just strange how this whole day, that day played out. Typically, yes, I call, between 8 and 9 in the morning, check on them, make sure they're up and around, everything's okay, did she need anything? I always call my dad on the weekends. He comes down, he has breakfast with us. We always cook a big breakfast on the weekends. Called my dad around 9, between 8:30 and 9, asked him if he wanted to come down for breakfast. He said he was headed to Choctaw, Arkansas to pick up some wagon wheels. I told him, I said, well, you need to eat breakfast. So he came down, he had breakfast. We were going to have company that evening. Some friends were coming over. I just got wrapped up in my chores. We had breakfast, my dad leaves. I got started doing my chores. My husband went outside to do his thing. And before I knew it, it was like 12:30. And at precisely 12:32 p.m., I called up there to see what they were doing, check on them. Vicki answers the phone, and I asked her, what are y'all doing? And she said that they had just been, piddling around the house, whatever, and Angela was painting her toenails, and Shelby was outside doing whatever she was doing. We chatted for, a few seconds, and I said, well, what's brother doing? And she said, well, I don't know. She said, he was in here pulling on my arm wanting to go for a car ride. She said, but he's been outside for 10 minutes or so, and she said he hadn't come back in. And I said, well, you need to send somebody outside to see where he is and make sure he's okay. I wasn't thinking in my head that he had wandered off. My thoughts were always that he would fall.
Sure.
Because if he fell, he wasn't able to get up by himself because he had to have help getting up out of the chair or getting in and out of the bed. We were to that point. So she told Shelby, she said, go outside and see if you see your papa anywhere. Well, I hear Shelby go out the front door. I could hear her standing on their front porch. You know, she called Papaw, Papaw a few times. She come back in. She says, I don't see him. So like Vicki said, she said, Shelby says she doesn't see him. And I said, well, you need to get up and go outside and see where he is. He could be behind the house, beside the house, anywhere out there. You know, he could be laying down. And she says, well, when my toenails dry, I'll slip my shoes on and I'll go out and see where he is. Well, that just went all over me. And I said, no, you're going to get up now and go outside and see where my brother is. She says, okay, hold on, let me get my shoes on. So supposedly she slips on her shoes, has me on the phone. All three of them are supposedly outside walking around the house, walking around the yard. She's telling me she doesn't see him anywhere. And I said, well, send somebody down, one of the girls down to Dad's, make sure he's not in his garage or somewhere down there at Dad's. I don't know that anybody ever went down there and looked. So she's still on the phone with me, walking around outside, looking for him supposedly. And right behind my brother's house, he had a big pole barn, and then another little building that he stored stuff in, and there was a gap in there. There used to be a fence all the way across the back where his property connected to some land that had just been clear cut, and the fence was down in that area between the two buildings. And I told her, I said, well, go look behind the barn and make sure he didn't walk behind there, which I didn't really think he did because I knew he had a bunch of scrap metal and stuff laying in between these two buildings because he was always working on cars and stuff. So he had, car parts and all kinds of stuff laying in there. But I thought, maybe he could have got behind one of those buildings and just was out of sight. So she supposedly went in between these two buildings and looked and said, oh, I see him. He's almost to the road. I'm going to go in the house, get my keys and get my car and go up on the road and pick him up. And their driveway is it's a long driveway. I don't know how long, but it's a long driveway. And then you're up on the county road. So I hung up the phone. We hung up. I ran out to the shop where my husband is working, tell him what's going on. I was just absolutely livid. Although in my head I'm thinking, how in the heck is he out there in that clear cut? That was what's going on in my head. I just couldn't imagine him being out there. And you would just have to pull up some pictures of what a clear cut looks like, or I can send you pictures.
And just a description, it's kind of brush and trees that are kind of knocked down.
It's tree stumps, tree tops, limbs, holes, all kinds of stuff. It's very rough terrain.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, I run out. I tell my husband what happened. I was livid, and I said, I'm going to wind up whipping out this power of attorney and bringing him down here and moving him in and taking care of him. My husband says, you just do whatever you think you need to do. I'm good with it. So I come back in the house. I start finishing up my chores. I wasn't even dressed. I was still in my PJs. I'm in here doing stuff, and probably about, 20 minutes or so later, I come through the kitchen and I hear my phone beeping, telling me I have a voicemail. I pick it up, and it's her. And all she said in that voicemail was, we can't find Rob. And that was it. So I go into a panic. I run back out to the shop. I tell my husband, I said, get on your quad, head up there. She says they can't find him. I said, I'm going to get my clothes on. I'm going to get my horse, and I'll be up there as quick as I can. And I'm just a horse person, have been all my life, and my thought in that situation is I can cover some ground, and, I can see in places where you can't see from a vehicle. That's just what I was thinking. I didn't really know what to think, so
Sure.
I did that. So I head up there. The clear cut was on both sides of the road. You got a county road and then clear cut, acreage on one side and clear-cut acreage on the other. So north and south side of the road is clear-cut. My neighbor lives probably about a half a mile. My first neighbor lives about a half a mile from my brother's place. She had called him first, couldn't get him, so she left a message on his answering machine. Then she got in her car and she drove in the other direction, probably a quarter of a mile to our
This is
other
Vicky.
neighbor's.
This is Vicky.
Yes, Vicky.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Gets in her car, drives to the other neighbor's house about a quarter mile behind. They live basically the way the property sits. This neighbor lives behind my brother. She drove up there. She told them that she'd lost Rob and she couldn't find him. So he gets on his quad and his wife gets in her truck and they drive back down by where she said she last seen my brother, but they're up on the county road. And then my other neighbor, he got his message and he come down there.
All right, so she's doing a fairly good job. I mean, maybe she shouldn't allowed him to go outside and walk that far away, but once she called you, it does seem that she went to the neighbors and was trying to get some people in gear to try to find Robert. That's my perception. And then, of course, your husband is heading up there on an ATV 2 miles away, and then you're on your horse heading up there.
Right.
So everybody, you got about maybe 5, 6, 7 people looking for Robert at this time from all angles.
Yes, including the mail carrier because she drove up. In fact, I think the mail carrier, she was the first one there before the other 2 neighbors got there. And I don't remember, I think it was Vicky's daughter, Angela, told the mail carrier, she says, Mr. Cox is missing. Well, when she told her that, she was thinking my dad. And she had to ask which Mr. Cox, and she said Robert. Well, she knew about my brother's condition, so she immediately got out of her truck and she started walking the road and looking because there's, other than the clear cut, everything else is fenced off because this is all farms out here, cattle and, you know, horses and stuff like that. So there's not a whole lot of area that's not fenced off.
Okay, so everybody's looking. Does your husband get up there on his ATV? Do you eventually get up there on your horse? And what was going on?
Yes, my husband got up there, so he took off on his quad, and he was driving, walking along the fence lines that were on the sides. He went on the south side first, I think, because she said that he was headed toward the county road, so that would have put him facing south. So he went that way. The neighbors went, my one neighbor, Dawn, he asked Vicky, where did she exactly see Robert? And she took him back into their yard, and they went through that gap that I talked about earlier, and they walked along the edge of the fence line there over all of the debris and stuff. And where she said he was at, she showed him where she said she last seen him. And he said when he looked on the ground, he said there was no shoe prints there.
And it was fairly muddy because it had been raining.
We had just come out of a 16-inch rain and snow either just before or just after that. So, yes, it was very muddy.
Okay.
So then my other neighbor, when I got up there, I went in on the south side of the clear cut on the east end and rode the outside edge of it on my horse and then kind of zigzagged back and forth across the clear cut. And mind you, my horse is bogging down belly deep in the middle of this clear cut because it is just so saturated and just a mess. So when I finally make my way back down to the road where Vicky and her daughter and some of the neighbors were at, because by this time it's coming out over the scanners and everything, and my neighbor's son, Gary, he's the one that actually called 911. Vicky did not call 911. My neighbor's son called 911 about a little after 1, I would say. Told them what was going on. Then Gary calls another neighbor that lives over here closer to me. He has a private plane. they get in the private plane. They're up in the air and flying before 1:30, looking for my brother from the air. And, you know, we have a lot of woods and stuff here, but at that time of year, you know, everything's died back. The woods are pretty dense.
Yeah, the leaves are down. The leaves are gone from the winter, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So he flew until approximately 5 o'clock that night. You know, he flew all day long, a big area, not just right here, but he focused in that area, but he also went out where he could see, you know, maybe he's walking down a dirt road somewhere or something, you know. So my neighbor, Dawn, and my other neighbor, Bob, plus my husband and my mail carrier, they told me, said, you know, my husband, first I ran into my husband, and he said, there is no way he could be out here. He says, it's not even possible. He says, no way can he walk this. He says, because I can't even walk it. So when I come down to the road on my horse, Vicki and her daughter and a couple of my neighbors were standing there in the middle of the road by Vicki's car. I rode my horse up to Vicki and I said, tell me exactly where you seen Robert at last. She pointed down into the clear cut and said, right there. And she pointed to this, it was like a bigger pile of brush there. And she said, right there. And then at that time, my neighbor Bob was standing right there in that area. And he yells up to the road and he says, who has stars on the bottom of their shoes? And Vicki says, I do. So apparently, I think, from best I can remember, I think the shoe print come into play when her and Dawn walked down there and she showed Dawn where she last seen Robert. That's when the shoe print got there, because Dawn said there was no prints there at all when him and her walked there.
All right, so she says that she saw Robert in this particular area, but the only sign that anybody was there was actually she was there from her own shoes, not from his shoes that he would normally wear, or the prints of this neighbor that's down there. His prints are there, but Robert's were not.
Right.
And we also have to remember that Robert's prints would look a lot different than everybody else's, just for the fact that he was shuffling along and could not walk like a regularly healthy human being.
Right, and he supposedly had on a pair of tennis shoes the day he disappeared, which would be accurate because that's what she typically had him in.
Okay. So I have to say, and probably listeners are thinking the same thing, this is probably one of the most extensive, what I would call amateur, being they're all just neighbors and people, amateur searches that I've heard of in a case that happens so quickly. It seems like, you know, within, let's say, a half hour, people were moving. You're there, your husband's there, the neighbor's there, there's a plane up in the air, and nothing. Nothing. Not to mention that Vicki beforehand had gone up and down the road in her car and talked to some neighbors and everything as well. Very extensive.
Right.
Okay. When did the police get involved? Did you get dogs? And then you even told me that a helicopter came out there with night vision or heat vision or something. Why don't you explain all of that? I think that happened within the next 24 to 48 hours.
Yes, the Sheriff's Department made it. Well, I think there was a couple of deputies. They heard, you know, on the scanner through the radio, you know, once my neighbor made the 911 call, a few of them showed up. And then eventually, you know, search and rescue, mounted patrol, you know, all of them. Then you had, you know, just people from the surrounding area, people that knew my brother, people we didn't even know. You know, people are just showing up. And, I mean, there's just people everywhere. Just walking that clear cut, walking up and down the road, everything. Well, Sheriff's Department, I think they get out here and they set up about a half a mile down the road from where my brother actually supposedly disappeared from. They set up about a half a mile down the road, put up their tent. You know, they're under there doing their thing, talking, making their plans. Of course, the sheriff himself wasn't here that day. But we have a emergency management system, which is the sheriff's half-brother, he's the emergency management guy, he was out here. And, they just got people. There's ATVs of all sorts out here. There's all kinds of people, like I said, walking. They're just everywhere. It wasn't a planned grid search because we just don't deal with these kind of things in this area, too much. So I don't think they didn't have a plan. So everybody's just looking. So you got, vehicles of all sorts out here. So I'm going to say between 2 and 3 sheriff's departments out here set up, and, people were just trickling in, from 1 o'clock on. So by, I think before dark, a little before dark, we had a helicopter come in, and it's one of those evacs, like if you're an emergency, out-of-the-way place, and you got to get to the hospital soon, the helicopter will come get you and take you where you need to go. They come in and flew, I don't know, maybe an hour or two before dark, and then they radioed down and said they had to quit because they had a call, they had to go, whatever, they left, but they did come in and help. Then it took until about 10 o'clock that night before state helicopter got here, and it was set up with, the infrared technology that it could see, heat.
Yeah.
And stuff, or, had the bright light on it, of course. So it gets here around 10. They had a couple of search dogs come in, around the same time, 2 bloodhounds. I was standing in my brother's yard. One of the deputies was there. I knew him. I could hear his radio. So I'm listening to what they're saying and telling people to do from the helicopter. The state police they're in control. They're giving the instructions on what they want done. So when it gets here, the sheriff's department calls everybody out of the woods, out of the clear cut. Helicopter guy says, no, keep them out there, keep them going, keep them looking. They're not going to interfere with what I'm going to do. So it goes up, the helicopter searching. That lasted a couple of hours. The dogs are searching. After the helicopter leaves, I go to my dad's house. There was people in my dad's house. One of the ladies that was handling one of the dogs, she comes in the house. She's asking questions about my brother. And she said, one of the dogs tracked out here in front of your brother's house and out to the end of the driveway, and the scent stopped. And then my dog tracked north up the clear cut and kind of started to go east across the clear cut.
Would either of those directions been in the area or direction that Vicky says she saw Robert in the clear cut in that field?
No.
Neither. Okay.
No. So they all leave, helicopter leaves. They basically call off the search, but yet, there's some of her family stayed behind, kept looking. Lots of our neighbors stayed and kept looking. There's not a whole lot you can do in the dark, but pretty much just drive the roads. My doctor, who was my brother's doctor, she's a nurse practitioner, she had come out that evening before dark, and she said, there's no way your brother could navigate, out there or walk any amount of distance without being found. And this is his doctor saying this. And so, so Sunday morning comes around.
What is it? Let's go back to this. What were was Brian there? Did Brian show up when he found out that his father was missing? Did he show up to help? And what was Vicky doing during this time?
I wasn't right there close to the house the whole time because I was looking, But I had neighbors telling me that my one neighbor said, I can't believe she's not upset and distraught. She said she's standing out in the road laughing and talking with people. Then I had somebody else tell me when she went to the house, there was people showing up with food and drink and, stuff like that for, the people that were looking, water and stuff like that. And she's just telling people, we got plenty of food, come on and eat. She was just as calm as you please. At some point, the guy, Chad, that my brother worked for, he was in Branson that weekend, which is about 3 hours away. He called Vicky and told her, he said, I just heard about Rob, because a lot of people called him Rob. Said, I'm on my way in. I'm going to come help look. She told Chad, no, don't worry. He's not coming back. You don't have to come in. He's not coming back.
Is that right?
And this was, within hours of the man supposedly disappearing from the property.
Okay.
She's telling him he's not coming back.
What about Brian? Did he show up to help in the search? That would be Robert's son, Brian, from his previous marriage.
Yes, he did show up at some point. I don't know what time he got there. I know sometime, I'm guessing 3, 4 o'clock, I did see him and his wife looking in a neighbor's field across the road from my brother's house, a little west of my brother's house. I did see him and his wife out there walking. Then by just before dark, I had people asking me, where's Brian? I haven't seen Brian. Different people coming up to me. I can't believe Brian's not out here. And, just stuff like that. And people telling me, there's no way your brother could be out here. We would have found him by now. Everybody was suspicious. There was just tons of suspicion.
Okay.
So
now, if I may ask, before the search was over on Saturday, which remember this, he disappeared allegedly on that Saturday sometime, let's say between 11 and noon, something like that, allegedly. And so this was search done all day. You got these planes, got these helicopters, but at the end of the day, before that night was over, before Saturday was over, did you have a chance to go into Robert's house just by yourself, maybe just looking around, and did you see anything unusual?
I did go in, and that was on the request of our constable. We have constables in each of our little communities here, and he's also a police officer, not with Yale County, but with the city. And he told me to go in. He told me where to look and what to look for. He said, check the freezer, check the cabinets, look under the beds, closets, any attic space, anything you can think of, look there. When I went in the house, Vicky and most of her family was outside and then standing in the yard. And then there was kids, including her granddaughter, in the house by themselves, and they were in there just horse playing. They were just being kids. I went and I looked all through the house, didn't see anything, that triggered me about anything. I just knew he wasn't in there. Come back out, I told him, I didn't see anything. There was nothing, he's not in there. And then he asked me, is there any crawl space, any attic space? And I said, there's no attic space. I said, but there is a small crawl space under his house at the kitchen area. But that was checked out, and there was nothing there, and didn't look like anything had been disturbed.
Okay, so you got to look inside the house. Nothing that really jumped out at you as being suspicious, and maybe we should get this out of the way before. To your knowledge, once again, I know you were not around your brother 24/7 during these last, let's say, the 6 months before. Had you ever known Robert to walk off before, just kind of randomly walk out and kind of walk away from the house without Vicky or Angela or your father knowing?
Never.
Okay, so Brian shows up. He's there. Vicky maybe seems a little, maybe too laid back. We just don't know. Maybe that's just her coping mechanism with all this. So you got to go into the house on Saturday night. Sunday, does the search continue? And how long does this, what I would call the official search, continue with the police being on site and dogs and things like that? How long did that continue?
They restarted back up about 8 o'clock that morning. They brought dive team with them that time, so there's guys running around in wetsuits. We have lots of stock ponds here. That's how people, water their cattle. There's a few abandoned wells in the area. So they searched the ponds, whatever small creek areas, wherever they knew of that there was a body of water, that was all checked. They checked abandoned wells. My husband and neighbors, they all went back after they left and rechecked the abandoned wells just to make sure, because there's been people missing that's been found, within feet of where they supposedly disappeared from, just for whatever reason. So it was all double-checked, some triple-checked. And then sometime Sunday afternoon, someone had called in, I'm assuming to the sheriff's department, told them that they had seen her car out around Spring Lake early Saturday morning. Don't know if there's any truth to that or not, but anyways, that was the call. So at 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon, they packed up, moved out, supposedly went over to the lake and searched out there around that. And the state helicopter came back Sunday morning as well and flew most of the day and even did a wider perimeter of just flying here in this area. I mean, he flew miles out, and they looked as well.
Which probably was not conceivable that Robert could have really walked that far.
Exactly.
They were probably even, my opinion on searches is usually people don't go far enough in situations like this. This time, though, it feels to me like they went more than far enough away from Robert's house to cover the area that Robert could have covered given his condition.
Right.
Okay. All right, so this official search, how long would you say that went on before everybody just said, well, we couldn't find anything? I know that you continued to search on your own privately, but as far as a kind of official with government involved, how long did that continue?
As far as a ground search, 24 hours or less.
Okay. And was it you that filled out the missing persons report, or was it Vicki who did that?
I don't know that there was ever one filled out.
Okay. To this day, you don't know who you personally did not do it?
No. All
Okay.
I know is 911 was called, and then everybody started showing up. I don't know if there was an official, missing persons report filed. I don't know. Okay.
So maybe it could be that Vicki did it. It could be that maybe Brian did it, but you didn't do it. And it could be that the police were just there and they just maybe filled it out themselves. Maybe that's possible, but they probably would have needed some help with some maybe description of what he was wearing. We just don't.
Yes,
to this day, what you're saying is 7 years later, you still don't know. Over 7 years later.
I don't know. I do know they had a description of what he supposedly was wearing that morning.
Okay. Well, he is in the NamUs database, so I would say that somebody filled out the report. So maybe it was Vicki, and we just don't know.
Yeah,
surely that would be something that you would remember. So, just after, let's say that once again, according to the official story, that he disappeared between 11 a.m. and noon on that Saturday. Let's say 48 hours later, let's get to Monday. What are you thinking? You and your husband, you go home maybe to get some rest. You're in your home by yourselves outside of where everybody else is. What do you two talk about? If you can say, what are your theories at this point? What are you thinking?
Well, me, my dad, and my husband, we're on the same page. We know he didn't walk off, and we know somebody in that house knows where he's at.
This is your opinion that early on, just 48 hours.
Well, even within hours.
Within hours.
Yeah.
Okay. Because simply for the fact of that, there's just no way that your brother in his condition could walk where he was walking or get away from able-bodied people in ATVs, people on horses, people in helicopters. He could not have evaded all of them.
Not in his physical condition. There is no way. The man couldn't even dress himself.
Okay. All right. So that was your belief, and frankly, that's a belief you have to this day, 7.5 years later. Okay.
Yes.
All right, let's move on. Let's get a little deeper into this. So we've gone over the generalities. We've covered Robert's mental state going back to 2008. We covered his physical state starting in 2010. We talked about Vicky, what she did and what she didn't do. We talked about that day, but there's still the intricacies of this case that I think play an important part that may point us in a direction. You had talked about the footprints before it, that they were not seen in the clear cut. Just to be clear, no footprints of Roberts were seen anywhere around his house outside.
No.
None.
No.
Not in the direction that Vicky said, not in the opposite direction of what he said, of she said, nothing.
Nothing.
Okay. All right. There was no footprints. Once again, I realize everybody would show up. That would make it difficult once everybody shows up to figure that out. But you were one of the first people on the scene. Your husband was one of the first people on the scene. Saw nothing.
Right.
Okay. And like you said, footprints could be seen because, as you stated, there was your neighbor who was in there and saw these footprints with the star, and you figured out that was actually Vicky's footprints.
He asked whose shoes have stars on the
Mhm.
sole, and she said mine do.
Okay.
And that's when he was down there in the spot where she said she last seen Robert.
Okay. Then you had talked about the dogs having two different paths that they followed, but you believe that you have an explanation for that. Can you explain?
Yes, I didn't know at the time why that came to be, but when we had a private individual, he'd been in law enforcement for years, and he had worked for Yale County Sheriff's Department back in the 80s. Through a friend, which was Chad's mother, his wife had recently passed away, and he had been seeing all this go on Facebook about my brother, because it was everywhere. So he asked Chad's mom, he says, can you reach out to the family and ask them if they would like some help? I'd like to investigate this case and see if we can find some answers, find Robert, find out what happened, blah, blah, blah. So I eventually reached out to him because, I just, at that point in time and in that situation, you don't know, what to do, where to go, whatever. It's just major chaos. So I reached out to him. He came in the latter part of June of 2011, a few months after Robert disappeared. He got permission from me and my dad and from Vicky to come in and do a little investigating.
So she permitted it?
Yes.
Okay.
And so once he came into the picture, probably within the first couple of visits with Vicky, he discovered that her daughter was wearing my brother's house shoes, and her granddaughter was wearing my brother's rubber boot. So the reason the dogs tracked in the direction they tracked is because the mail carrier seen Vicky's daughter, Angela, with my brother's house shoes on, walking across that field in front of my brother's house, in front of the tree line, and out to the end of the driveway. So that's why the scent was tracked the way the dog tracked out to the end of the driveway. So that excluded the theory of somebody driving through and picking him up at the end of the driveway that day. And then it also ruled out the part about the clear cut of the dog tracking him north and a little bit east, because my husband and some others seen Angela and her daughter in the clear cut side going north, and they both had on my brother's shoes.
But I have a question for you. Were their footprints seen in the clear cut? I guess what I'm saying, if there was only, the footprints were seen, none were seen that were Robert's, but they were wearing Robert's shoes.
That I don't know because, like I said, that was 10 o'clock at night before, after 10 when the dogs come in and picked up a scent. So
Right.
That's what we're going by, is that we know they had their shoes on and we know they were in these areas with those shoes
Right.
on.
I'm just wondering how that plays out because, as you said, you didn't see Robert's any footprints anywhere. But if they were wearing Robert's shoes and they at least went into one area that was soft enough to generate footprints, would that not look like it was? Would it not look like Robert was walking, even though it would have been one of these, the girl or the young woman?
Well, but by this time, as far as being out in front of the house, that's all grassy area, so you're not really going to see, footprints up there.
Okay.
And then as far as being in the clear cut, I don't know because, this was never put together until, months later about them wearing the shoes and how the dogs tracked.
Okay. All right.
And then by that time, you've got several people that's been out there and walking in the same areas as well. So
So we're not sure how that figures into no footprints or footprints, but what this private investigator was able to determine was that the daughter and the granddaughter of Vicky were wearing Robert's shoes that day.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Why don't you also let's go next to, we have to remember that Vicky claimed that she was getting her toenails painted by her daughter Angela when Robert was outside, and this is how it all got started, and this is what was going on when you called her. Why don't you tell the listeners the toenail polish story?
Okay. After the investigator, Mr. Hodges, comes into the picture, and he's visiting with Vicky, she's telling him, about me. Well, actually, I think that she didn't really comment about me calling that morning. It's like she kind of voided that about me calling up there.
Okay.
And so she started in by telling him that, her daughter was painting her toenails while they were doing laundry, waiting on that, et cetera, et cetera. And so he asked her, he said, well, walk me through your toenail painting. And she said, well, first, she puts on a clear coat, and then she put on toenail polish, then another clear coat, then toenail polish. And then the last coat was some stuff called 10 speed. And this stuff is supposed to be, you put it on as your last coat, it's supposed to dry your fingernail polish, toenail polish, within 6 to 8 seconds, to where you can put your toes in your shoes or your hands in your purse and it will not smudge. I even went and bought a bottle to try it out, and it does work. I researched it online, read it all, printed it off for Mr. Hodges, and gave it to him after we learned about this. So he tells her in one of her visits, he says, do you have those shoes that you put on that day when your toenails were supposedly wet when you went out to look for Robert? And she said, yeah, they're in my closet. He said, well, I don't want them today. He said, but when I come back out in a day or two, he said, I want to see the rubber boots, Robert's house shoes, and your shoes. I need to take pictures of all of this. So a couple of days later, he goes back out. She's got the shoes out there. And if I remember correctly, I think he said that when he was looking at her shoes, she said, see, this proves my timeline because there's toenail polish in my shoe. There was a tongue on her shoe, like the tongue of your shoe. I think they Velcroed the shoes that she was wearing. I think they had a Velcro strap, kind of a Mary Jane type of shoe, Tommy Hilfiger. He flipped the tongue back, and in the seam of the tongue where it's sewed to the fabric was a perfect red dot of toenail polish in that seam of that shoe, like somebody dipped it in the bottle and put a dot there and it dried. So we have pictures of that.
Okay.
To me, that's suspicious. Because to me, if your toenails are wet, regardless of what you put on them, you're going to have a smudge, not a dot.
Yeah, it's going to be a smudge.
And it's going to be possibly deeper into the shoe, or there will be more, in the toe area of the inside of your shoe.
Okay. And he showed that to you, like you said, you have pictures of that.
Yes, I have a
Okay.
lot of the stuff that
Okay.
he had. Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so not sure what to make of that either. Maybe this is like a Columbo moment. Not sure. Okay, so that's interesting. Let's go next. 2, we talked about the power of attorney. When did the power of attorney issue come up? When did Vicky finally find out that you had power of attorney? She didn't even know about this until after he disappeared.
That came about in, let's see, she moved out in March of 2012.
So a year later.
Yes.
Wow, okay.
She stayed there approximately a year. She moves out. She didn't even tell my dad she was moving. She just moved because communication between her and my dad started breaking down about mid-2011. She got to where, because my dad was always bringing up things, asking her, why didn't you just bring him to my house? Why didn't you, if he was tired of taking care of him, you just should have told us, and, just stuff. What a parent would normally think and do in that situation. So anyways, their communication started breaking down. So when she moved, she didn't tell my dad that she was moving. She didn't tell him that she was going to rent out the property or anything. Because all total, there's almost 40 acres there. And my dad had originally owned the biggest part of that. And then when my dad remarried in 2006, my brother and Vicky bought the 35.9 acres from my dad. And then when my dad moved back my dad got married in 2000, got a divorce, then moved back in 2006. My brother says, well, I'll just clear you off a pad. We'll put you a house right here, which is on the 35.9, and you can, do whatever you want here. It's yours. And then my dad gave them back $24,000, but there was never a change of deeds or my dad's name added to the deed or anything. He just gave them cash back for putting his house there and all of that. So in 2012, when she moves out, she's going to lease my brother's place to somebody else. So then that's where the power of attorney comes into play because, it's in there, to maintain, take care of his business, his real estate.
Sure.
So my thinking is I don't want anything done different. I don't want her making any money off of my brother until we find out what's happened to my brother. I think that's only fair. So I get Mr. Hodges puts me in touch with an attorney that he knows. He comes in pro bono, thank the Lord. He helps us. So he just puts my brother's half of the property in my dad's name to kind of hold things up. And then the other half is still in Vicky's name so that it's not like, we're coming in and trying to take over or take anything away, just trying to buy time until we figure out what's happened with my brother. So we do that. So she gets her an attorney. We go to court. She tells them, or her attorney tells the judge, she wants a death certificate filed because they're trying to kill my power of attorney. Because as long as he's considered missing, he's still alive. But once he's declared dead, that kills your power of attorney.
Right.
So in 18 months after he disappeared, she gets a death certificate.
When did she find out that you had a power of attorney? How soon after he disappeared did she find that out?
When we started going to court in 2012.
Okay. Would you say she was a little surprised by that?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Would you say that she was a little? Would you say that she was a little angry about that?
Oh, I'm sure.
Okay.
And then she started involving the man that was renting my brother's property in all of this. And he had nothing to do with any of it. But he come to all the hearings. He was involved in all of the hearings.
Okay. All right. So this, so once again, she got your brother Robert declared legally dead 18 months later. So let's say August of 2012, something like that?
It was July.
July of 2012. So 18 months later. So she got Robert declared legally dead, and your power of attorney essentially went away with it.
Mhm.
Okay. Let's move on to this. Now, this is something that happened not in 2012, but in 2011. In fact, I believe not long after Robert disappeared. Can you tell the listeners about this accident insurance that she, the Vicky, and Robert had?
When Mr. Hodges come into the picture and was working with Vicky, he had asked her on one of his visits with her if the police had asked her if she had any life insurance policies, any kind of insurance on him, and she said no, they didn't. And he said, well, do you? And she says, well, I have a burial policy and an accident policy. And she told Mr. Hodges, she said, I think I might have messed up. He said, what do you mean? She said, well, on that accident policy, she got a thing in the mail a few weeks after Robert disappeared, asking to increase this accident policy. So she increased it 3.5 weeks later after he disappeared from $50,000 to $200,000 after he disappeared.
Wow.
So he asked her if she had that policy, and she said, no, it's in a lockbox at the bank, because her son was working at the bank at that time. She said it was in her and her son's lockbox at the bank. So he started writing down information of what company it was and this, that, and the other.
So she openly admitted to this, just freely admitted that, in retrospect, kind of thing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Mr.
Okay.
Hodges, she sure did.
Okay.
So Mr. Hodges has all of that information. He took it eventually, probably close to maybe not, some months later, he eventually met with the prosecuting attorney, approached him with all of this stuff, and tried to get something done. And to this day, I don't know if that insurance policy was ever collected on. I don't know if the death or the burial policy was ever collected on. I don't know, because you can't get anybody to do their job to tell you anything.
All right, so you don't know if she got 50, you don't know if she ever received any money, whether, we don't even know if this is an accident. We know where we're going with this, but she eventually got Robert declared legally dead. Maybe he did die by an accident, but you don't know if she ever collected $50,000 or $200,000, or maybe the policy was voided because of what she did. You don't know any of that.
No, don't know nothing.
Don't know nothing. Okay. All right, was this also the insurance policy that you talked about, that it didn't seem like it was Robert's signature?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if it was that one or the burial. I just remember some months later when we met with Mr. Hodges, he come here to my house. Him, my husband, we were sitting here at my dining table talking. He's showing us, some of his notes, some emails, because he made her put things in email. He made her do timelines. He made her do a timeline of the toenail painting, just different aspects. He made her put everything in an email to him so that he had it on paper, and then when he would see her, he'd make her sign it. So that it was formal, it was accurate documentation, and she agreed that it was accurate documentation. So when he come here and he had those insurance papers, and like I said, I don't remember which one it was, but I know it was her signature, not my brother's.
Okay, so you got to see that.
Because my brother did not believe in any kind of life insurance policies or anything like that. And you can ask anybody that knows him, because he knows that people get killed for stuff like that.
Sometimes.
It's true.
Sometimes, yeah. Sure.
So,
okay.
He just didn't believe in that kind of stuff.
Okay, so let me just set this up for the listener. So he disappears in February of 2011. Approximately 3 to 4 weeks, maybe a month later, Vicky gets this insurance policy that allegedly already existed regarding the accident insurance. She adds some benefits to it to go from 50 to 200,000. We don't know though if she ever collected. In fact, maybe the insurance company found out about this and voided the entire thing, because it does sound a little shady. But she admitted it to the private investigator, so it's not like she was trying to hide it. She admitted it, and we don't know if she ever collected. But then she finds at some point out about the power of attorney, and eventually she goes to court 18 months later to have Robert declared legally dead.
Right.
That was how all the paperwork side of this happened. The accident insurance, there was no life insurance, the power of attorney, and the declaration of a person being deceased.
Right.
And once that happened, she was free to do whatever she wanted to, because you didn't have power of attorney anymore.
Right.
All right. And did you fight her trying to declare Robert legally dead? Did you fight that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. My dad
Okay.
and I both. Mm-hmm.
And do you have any reason why the court decided to agree with Vicky instead of you?
I've got lots of reasons why. Whether they're true or not, I don't know.
Well, it's just, what do you think?
I think either payoff, favor, something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
okay.
Because, by law, it's 7 years.
Well, sometimes, I mean, I've had cases where people have been declared legally dead much sooner than that. I mean, it depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, I mean,
it depends on the circumstances. It does,
Yeah, just depending on what the family wants. This part of the family didn't want it done. That part the other side was in a hurry to get it done.
Okay. All right. So 18 months later, I mean, just as an example of if somebody's in a private plane, and they crash into, the ocean, and the plane's found, but the person isn't found, that's usually not something probably that's going to have to wait 7 years. It's probably something that's going to probably be, as far as a declaration of somebody being deceased, is probably going to happen fairly quickly. It's not going to be 7 years. So it just depends on the circumstances. But I can understand in this case that those aren't the circumstances, that he was just merely walking outside of his house, allegedly.
Yeah.
And okay. So we have that. So you did try to fight it. What did Vicky offer as an explanation as to why she wanted to do it?
Don't know, because she wasn't talking to any of us by then.
Okay. And we have to remember, at one point, while she and Robert were married, you two were very close, going back to the 90s, I guess.
Right. Yes.
Okay. Overall, to this day, do you have any idea how much money Vicky might have made from Robert's disappearance?
Well, she wound up with all of the property in the house, plus my dad's house. My dad built his house there. You're talking 50, 60 grand in the small house that he built, and they gave her my dad's house without any compensation whatsoever. They just gave him lifetime right to live in his own house and have use of the property.
Okay. But in fact, you even stated that 18 months later, Vicky didn't even live in that house anymore. She was renting it out. And I think you told me she was renting it out until sometime recently.
Yeah, he probably moved out 4 or 6 months ago. Left her high and dry.
Okay. Okay, and we'll get into why she wasn't living there in a bit, but she did rent it out. Let's move on to this. where is Brian, Robert's son, in all of this? I guess Brian is married. He and his wife, where are they? Let's put it this way. Before Robert disappeared, how would you say the relationship was between Brian and Vicky? Your opinion.
They got along. I mean, they weren't like super close. Even as a kid growing up with Vicky, they got along decently. After the fact, after Robert disappeared, he just became thick as thieves with her and her family. He spends every holiday with her family and her. They've had family portraits, like the October of 2011 after Robert disappeared. Brian, his wife, was with Vicky and all of her family and kids, her sister, her mother. They had a big family portrait, big picture session. It's just weird. He's 100% in that family where.
Okay. Being that he is your nephew, when was the last time would you say that he was to your house for some sort of family gathering or something like that?
Well, we always had the family gatherings at my brother's house because his house is bigger, so Thanksgiving and Christmas was always up there. But the last time I ever seen or talked to Brian was on the Monday after my brother disappeared, the 21st of February.
So just to be clear, you have not talked to your nephew for 7.5 years?
Nope.
And he lives in the same town you do?
Well, he lives about 20 miles from me, but he works 10 miles away.
Okay. Never calls you, nothing? He and his wife? Okay.
Nope.
All right. And do he and his wife have any children?
He has one little boy that I think is about 2-3 years old now.
Okay, so obviously you haven't seen the little boy either, your grandnephew.
I've seen pictures of him on Facebook.
That's it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so in your opinion, since Robert disappeared, Brian and his wife have become very close with Vicky and her family, even though it doesn't seem like it was that way before Robert disappeared.
Correct.
Okay. Did somebody in your family confront Brian about Robert's disappearance at one point?
My dad has on several occasions.
Can you encapsulate that and how those have usually gone down?
My dad, shortly after my brother disappeared, my nephew stopped talking or having anything to do with my dad, just like he did me. So my dad went down to his employment and approached him one day and wanted to know why he didn't want anything to do with him anymore and why he wasn't concerned about what happened to his dad and, why wasn't he, working with us to try to find out what happened to his dad. And basically his words were, he's dead, he's gone, they just want to sell out and move on.
And you told me that, of course, you were not there, but your dad was. This is a little bit of hearsay, but you had told me that Brian did not want to look your father in the eye. His own grandfather did not want to look him in the eye.
Correct. Whenever my dad would go down, which he went down several times over the course of the first couple of years, he would just tell me how he would just look down at the ground, wouldn't make eye contact. He didn't want to engage in any conversation. My dad would start talking to him. He said he'd just turn around and walk off.
Okay.
He won't even associate with, he works for a car dealership. And so a lot of people have vehicles from this dealership right here. And a lot of them are neighbors that he's known all of his life since he's lived here. And he avoids them when they come in, because it's like he knows they're going to ask, have you heard anything about your dad?
Okay.
So he just avoids.
Okay, so he avoids them. We're not sure for what reason. We can guess, but we don't know for sure. All we know is that he doesn't want to talk to them. Okay.
Right.
Now, this is something you had just told me yesterday, something about a message from Brian to Vicky that she sent to you. What was this? And do you have this message?
I do.
All right, please explain what it
So does
says.
the sheriff's department.
Okay, all right.
In December of 2010, when we were discussing to have Robert put on hospice, because my dad and I wanted, to get a nurse or somebody to come in and help out, maybe have a outside third party, be able to talk to Vicki and explain to her how important it is for Robert that he needs to eat a certain way and have certain types of foods, because sometimes when you get family involved, it's just, things just get taken the wrong way. Of course, tensions are running high because things just aren't going like we think they should be. So anyways, hospice comes in, and my dad and I wanted to have a feeding tube put in so that we could see if it would help and build him back up, because he went from being 150 pounds down to 120, and then I think by the time he disappeared, he was back up to about 130 from the Ensure and from the pureed food. So you can do that on hospice as long as you have it done before you actually enter into hospice. But once you're on hospice, you can't have any thing added to you to sustain life, because hospice is obviously about the end of life, although it doesn't always mean that for some people. But anyway, so there was a big discrepancy between family. Me and Dad was wanting it. Vicky, my brother's son, the stepkids, they weren't wanting the feeding tube. So one night, me and Vicky are going back and forth through Facebook messaging, talking about it, and she says, I got this message from Becca, which is my nephew's wife.
Mm-hmm.
So she sends it to me. And the message basically said, and this is my nephew's wife who is typing it out, Brian's wife. She says, we will go along with whatever you all want to do, but we really feel that Rob wouldn't want that, because Robert told Brian at some point that if he ever got sick like his mom, he would want Brian to kill him.
I see.
So,
okay.
Of course, when I seen that, it obviously enraged me, but I just always kept that message because, you're not thinking about your family doing harm to one of your family members. So I just always kept it.
Did you ever confront, I know you aren't talking to him now, but back then, did you ever confront Brian about this message? Did anybody?
No, I did not.
Did anybody?
No, I did not. Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Does that sound like something that your brother would have said? Does that sound like a thought that he would have had?
I don't believe so, no. Because my brother was very much about, taking care of each other. I don't see him saying that or wanting that. At least not in that manner.
Right. And surely not in those words that he would want Brian to kill him.
Yeah, that would be asking a lot of, husband, wife, whatever, mother, father, to say, hey, if I get a certain way, just shoot me. Right.
I'm thinking that something along the line, I've never been there. I realize that end-of-life issues can be very difficult.
Right.
But to use the word kill seems a little harsh. Maybe put out of my misery, take my pain away. That she would type it that way is certainly strange.
Right. So from that letter to where my dad had a visit with my nephew at work, my nephew did bring up in one of those conversations that my dad tried to have with him about my brother.
Mm-hmm.
My dad had asked him something about, or like, don't you want to know where your dad is or what's happened to your dad or something to that effect. And Brian said something to the effect like, well, if they did kill him, it would be a mercy killing.
I see.
That's what he told my dad.
Okay. All right. Okay. That I don't know what to make of that. But certainly the words that certainly does seem to go together. It seems
Mm-hmm.
the message from December of 2010 and then what Brian said later does seem to
Right.
go together. Okay. Let's move on to this. In fact, before Robert even disappeared, you had brought up, maybe with your husband, maybe with some other people, the issue that possibly was, being that he deteriorated so quickly, could Robert have been poisoned? Did you actually look into this?
B and the investigator did, and the reason that came up is because at one of his visits, when he was up there talking with Vicky, she told him about a bottle of poison that used to be out in one of the sheds. Don't remember what it is, what kind of poison it was, or anything. So the investigator started researching about some poisons. And apparently he come across one that could have some effects similar to what Robert was experiencing. You know, I don't know. But
Okay.
I don't rule anything out until I know for 100%.
Right. Could this have been maybe poison being that you had, maybe buildings out there, whatever, maybe poison for like rats or something? Is that do
Possible,
you think
yeah.
that's why it would have been out there?
It's possible, yeah.
Okay. The listener should know that I took a look into poison. I'm not an expert. I just Googled it like anybody else could for maybe about a half hour to an hour looking around, and I could not find any poisons that would necessarily bring about the circumstances, the condition that Robert had. As far as the dropping of the head and becoming nonverbal and all of these things, of course, with poisons, it seems it's more along the lines of throwing up and fevers and things like that if somebody is being poisoned slowly, whether it's with cyanide or whatever else. I couldn't find anything where that would happen. In fact, what I found is like kind of the opposite. It's the lack of certain minerals in the body can make that happen. Selenium being one of them can cause your head to drop. So, not sure what to think. Obviously, that's it's popular. I can think of a case where I'm originally from in Pittsburgh, where a doctor poisoned his wife, who was a doctor, and didn't get away with it, and now he's in jail. So it does happen, and that was just within, I think, the last 5 years or something. So it does happen. I'm just not sure if Robert's, the way you describe them to me, uh, goes along with that, but it's certainly something I can understand why you looked into it. Did the private investigator, we're going to talk about him in particular a little bit, but phone records, did he happen to look into Vicky's and maybe Angela's phone numbers, maybe other people in her family, to see what their phone records say about that night?
Yes, he did.
Okay. What do you find?
I printed off mine for him, of course. And back then, when you printed off Verizon phone records, it would give you where your phone's pinged. I don't think they do that anymore now. I think it's just call in, call out. But it would actually tell you where your phone pinged. That Friday night, or that Friday before he disappeared, they had supposedly gone to Russellville because it was Brian's birthday to drop off a gift and a card and to see Brian. Then she went and picked up her daughter, Angela, and the granddaughter. And then from there, they supposedly seen her son at the bank at some point on Friday. And then they come home. Well, then around, I don't know, maybe 7, 8 o'clock that night, she had gotten a call from Brian, is what showed on the phone records, Brian or Becca, either one.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of raised suspicion with him because they had just seen him earlier that day. And from looking at the records, because I think he went back about 3 months with the phone records. So from comparing, it was kind of out of character to have a phone call, that late at night. Not many phone calls really to Brian. So that just kind of stood out to him.
Okay. And what about Vicky's brother?
You mean her son?
Or her son, Carl, I'm sorry, her son, yes.
Carl was supposedly in Branson that weekend. But from what I remember about the phone calls from Mr. Hodges is that Carl's phone was pinging from Russellville instead of from Branson, Missouri area.
And Branson is how far away?
A good 3 hours.
Okay. I see. So the belief is that he was in Branson, but you have seen records that show that he could have been right in the area around Robert's house, of course, around where you live as well.
Right, because she claimed that he was in Branson, but then she also said that she'd seen him at the bank on Friday. So I don't know if he left Friday to go to Branson or what, but he was out here that Saturday. He got here about noon and helped look for Robert. Carl did.
So maybe he went out there, found out about it, and drove back. Maybe.
Could be.
Could be. Okay. Any records regarding that night? Any pinging? Is there any proof that any of their phones pinged outside would have been the area right around Robert's house? That they went anywhere that night after your father was over there that evening, that Friday evening?
Best I can remember him saying, Mr. Hodges, was that the phones were pretty quiet except for the one call from Brian.
Okay. And then into Saturday, was your call to Vicky the first call she received that day? Had she used the phone earlier that morning at all? Once again, to your knowledge. If you don't know, that's fine.
To the best of my knowledge, I think so.
Okay.
So that would have been 12:32 p.m.
Right. And I'm guessing that her daughter's phone, Angela's phone, about the same. Pretty quiet.
As far as I can remember, yes.
Okay. All right. So the phone records don't show a lot. Maybe they show something. Maybe with Carl, we just don't know. Brian could have simply been calling Vicky to see how his dad was doing. Just don't know. Right. Let's talk a little bit about the private investigator. You mentioned him, Mr. Hodges. You said how he got involved. Do you continue to talk to him to this day about Robert's case?
I haven't spoke with him in about, it's probably been a little over a year. He started having some serious health issues. In fact, a few months into my brother's case, he suffered a widowmaker's heart attack where he should have died, but he didn't.
Oh, my.
So that set us back quite a bit, because of all the recoup time. He just had a lot of health issues. He actually is dating my friend's mother now that moved here from Louisiana. So I do keep up with him through my friend, but I haven't spoke with him, in a while.
Okay. Do you know if he's even still working on Robert's case?
That I'm not aware of. I'm probably not, because we're just kind of stuck because the sheriff's department has to be willing to release it to somebody who wants to do something more, and they won't. Like, I tried to get them to release it and give it to state police, let state police work it. They won't do that. They won't release it to FBI. They just won't release it. It's just sitting there. They claim it's an open, ongoing investigation, but nothing's being done. It's just there.
Okay, and we'll talk about the police and your experience with them in a minute. So your personal experience, I should say. Mr. Hodges, in his opinion, when you were talking to him, and there's even an interview out there on one of the TV stations that they talked to him, I think, for a few minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Is it in his opinion that the way Vicky described things, how they went down on Saturday, that there are reasons to believe that that's not what happened that day?
Yes, absolutely, he does.
Okay, and would that have been part of one of the last conversations you had with him until you haven't spoken to him for a while? Is that his belief?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
That's his belief.
Okay. All right, let's talk about the police. It seems to me, my impression is that you and they have had a contentious relationship almost from the beginning. Is that true?
Yes.
In fact, you told me that you had an argument with, I don't know if it was a sheriff or the chief of police. Maybe you need to detail that first.
On Monday, after my brother disappeared, I wanted to get more search dogs. Like I said, I have no idea how these missing person things work. I've never been involved with one, never followed these types of things until this incident happened. So I was just reaching out to any and everybody. I was on that internet constantly, reaching out to state police, FBI, the marshals, what do you call them?
Deputies?
No, not the Texas Rangers, but we have them in these states back here. The
constables?
No, they're marshals. They're kind of like the ones they have in Texas. Anyways,
Texas Rangers. Texas Rangers.
Similar to them, but we have them here. I just can't think of what they call them. But anyways, I reached out to them. I was reaching out to, a lot of the missing persons things, like Lost and Missing was a big help to me. That Cynthia Karen was running at the time. They helped me get the flyers going, and, they made some brief contact with the sheriff's office to get, a little bit of information and stuff. But that Monday, after my brother had disappeared, I wanted more search dogs because I just felt like the ones the night before, from what I was hearing on the police, on the sheriff's department scanners, that, the dogs just weren't working well, weren't tracking well. I was hearing the handlers, talk about this over the radio because like I said earlier, I was standing right next to one of the deputies. So I just felt that we needed to get, some fresher dogs out here and try again, grasping at straws. So I called, and the sheriff wasn't in that morning. He hadn't got there yet, so they said they would have him call me back. So he called back, and we know that he's known for having a temper and, just not being a nice person. So I had my phone on speaker, and my husband was standing there. And I told him, I said, I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job or anything. I said, but I was just wondering if we could get some fresher dogs out here and try this again, because I'm not comfortable with how the dogs worked. And, of course, I'm upset, and I'm crying, still, because I don't know where my brother is. And so he started in telling me that, he's been doing this for 20 years. He had set the tone. He says, I've been doing this for 20 years. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I can tell you right now your father is not out there. And I said, it's not my father, it's my brother. Okay, well, your brother's not out there. And, he just started going off on me. And I said, look, I said, like I said, I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job. I'm just asking if we can get some fresher dogs. Well, by this point, he just starts cussing me, and he's ranting and raving that, this is his investigation. If I don't like how he's doing it, he'll just drop it, and I can take over and do it and handle it however I want to. And, he just went off his rocker, basically. So I hang up, and then about 2 o'clock that afternoon on Monday, the 20th or the 21st, he calls me back and he says, I got your dogs coming. They'll be there at 3. And he hung up. So about 3 o'clock, they show up there at my brother's. The sheriff was there, and a couple of his detectives was there. One of his detectives, when I walked up there to where he was standing in my dad's yard, he says, I just want to apologize to you for the sheriff's attitude. And I said, well, it's not your place to apologize for how he handled it. I said, that's not your place. I said, he's the one that owes me the apology. So then that search began with those dogs, and that was an extensive dog search. And it was 2 ladies. They had a couple of dogs come out. Lady was very experienced, and she told us right off the bat, she says, it's going to be hard because there's been so much traffic, all the fumes from the ATVs. It's just really hard in a situation like this, but we're going to go ahead and give it a shot. So they worked it for, an hour or so while the sheriff's department was out there. And then the sheriff's department loaded up and left, and the ladies stayed behind. They were out there a good couple of hours working their dogs. And she talked to us extensively, explained to us about search, with the dogs and the weather and just, everything. And the only place those dogs hit was both of them hit around my brother's front door.
And just to be clear, how long after your brother disappeared did this happen? How long?
Well, he disappeared supposedly on Saturday the 19th at around 1 o'clock, and this was around 3, 4 o'clock on the Monday after.
Okay. All right. So a couple of days later.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then she went home, and she went home and she, wrote everything out, detailed where they searched and how it all happened, how the dogs reacted and everything. And then when Mr. Hodges come into play a few months later, she gave him a copy of that. So he had that as well to go by what her dogs did that day.
And what's interesting is those dogs did not follow the same path that the other ones did, like you said before regarding Angela and her daughter wearing the shoes. One did not go out to the road, and the other one did not go along that out into that clear cut.
I think one of them did kind of go over in that area in front of his house where Angela had walked earlier. But like I said, there's so much traffic, and I'm not saying it was a hit, but, they knew to walk that area, but they hit on the front door.
Okay.
So, but I know dogs aren't always accurate.
They're not. They're not, and my listeners know how I feel about dogs.
Yeah, and I get that.
Okay. So would you say that your relationship with the police, sheriff's office, whoever, has continued to be contentious over the last 7.5 years?
Yes, because it took 2.5 weeks before the main detective that was working my brother's case ever came out and talked to me about this whole situation, and I had to keep calling. It was mostly done through emails and phone calls with Detective Foster. And a few days, that first week I asked him, I said, are you guys not going to come out and, get some kind of DNA going in case, his body is found somewhere, maybe even in another county, another state, who knows? And he asked me if I could go, and I have the email, he asked me if I could go up there and get his toothbrush or his hairbrush. And I said, that's your job. And
Okay.
then it was another couple of months, I think in May, before state police got involved. And I pushed that issue through a friend who had connections with one of the state police detectives that work with Yale County Sheriff's Department. And when I went and visited with that detective, that's when he swabbed me in May of 2011 for my DNA. And then shortly after that, they come out, done a reenactment in the clear cut with deputies in the spot where Vicki claims she last seen Robert. They put 4 or 5 guys out there, had them walk off in different directions because her timeline is 5 minutes from getting her car out of the garage, going out the driveway, coming up the road to where she last seen him. He disappeared in less than 5 minutes, according to her.
Mm-hmm.
So they did a 5-minute reenactment, made her go through the same exact steps, had the guys out there. Everybody was still visible, and this was able-bodied people. Then I think a short time after that, they come out late one night and search the house, with the whatever those lights are they use to check for blood or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So it does seem, though, that they did some things, but that was early on. The last few years, pretty much nothing.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. However, somebody, we're not just going to use it. We're not going to use any names. There's somebody within the police department, one of these departments, has expressed an opinion to you. And what was that opinion?
They said that they agreed that there is family involvement.
There's family involvement in Robert's disappearance.
Right.
Which is a general idea of what you have as well.
Right.
Okay. Did that come as a surprise to you when this person told you that? Did that come as a surprise? Did that just... I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to ask you who it was.
Right.
I know who it was.
I'm not going to say it was a surprise per se, but I'm glad that they're looking at it that way.
Okay. All right. Okay. We've covered a lot. We've been talking for almost 2.5 hours now about Robert's case. How has this affected you and your family? Maybe we should start with your father, who is 91 now.
It's been really tough on my dad. He has a lot of sleepless nights, even to this day. I can't imagine what it would be like to lose one of your kids like that and not know, where they are, what's happened.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have your thoughts, which typically aren't good ones.
Yeah.
Just the not knowing. And that's how it is with all of us that have somebody that's missing. The not knowing is just indescribable. I really absorbed myself into this for probably the first 4 years, maybe even 5, to the point to where it was making me physically ill. And I just had to back off and step away for a little bit and get my life back, because I have a husband, kids, grandkids. I got to take care of my dad, and it's always with you. It's always there. No matter what you're doing, no matter what you're thinking, it's still there. But you do have to move on. You do have to do what you have to do, but it doesn't mean that we're giving up.
Right. So it's been, and he still lives in that same house right next to where Robert disappeared.
Yes, he does.
He does, and he has to look at that house every day.
Every day, and I've tried to get him to move and come down here and, put him in another house or a trailer or something, and he won't do it.
Mm-hmm.
He stays right there.
I did, speaking of which, being that I just thought of this, what has Vicki done with her life since Robert disappeared?
Well, about 2 years after let's see, the death certificate was 2012. Within a year and a half, well, let's just say less than 2 years, she remarried. And she's, ever since she left out of here, out of Yale County, she's just gone on with her life like nothing ever happened. The woman has never hung a flyer. She's never done a news interview. Nothing.
When was the last time you spoke to Vicky?
March 16th of 2011.
You know the exact date?
Yep.
You didn't even speak to her like 18 months later during this whole death certificate deal. Never spoke to her there. Never ran into her outside the courtroom or anything like that. I don't exactly know how that works, but nothing.
Nope. She avoided me after March 16th.
Okay. And you've told me that the new guy in her life looks a lot like your brother.
Well, people say that. I don't see it.
Okay.
And I think the reason they say that is because as far as stature, you know, he's probably the same height and build as my brother. He's a lot older. But, you know, he wears a beard like my brother did. He dresses like my brother did. My brother always wore Western shirt, cowboy hat, jeans, boots, and that's how this guy dresses. And so people that, you know, they see him out or they see the pictures on Facebook, you know, they're like, wow, he looks like your brother. But I think it's just because of the similarities of the,
okay.
You know.
So she got married to another man. Doesn't seem the least bit concerned. Like you said, hasn't done anything for any newspapers or websites or any podcasts like this one to talk about Robert and that day. Has never done anything. You have been primarily responsible for that, almost solely responsible for that.
Yes.
Okay.
Because I don't want people to forget.
Of course. And what about Vicky's daughter Angela and her son Carl? You told me that Angela moved into somebody's house.
Well, Angela, as far as I know, she's living in a trailer house behind or on the same property as Vicky and her new husband is now. I was told that by some of her husband's now's family, his stepkids. I've been in contact with his stepkids.
Do you think that this new husband knows about Robert and how he disappeared?
I think he knows somewhat, but I don't. But
I'm not saying he knows it. I'm not saying that he knows what exactly happened, but does he know that the former husband of Vicky disappeared?
Well, I would assume, because I mean it's been everywhere, and I put a billboard up in Russellville a couple of years ago, so it would be kind of hard to not know.
Okay. Okay. All right. So he has to know, and he's with Vicky, and we don't know what kind of relationship they have, but they're still married in 2018.
Right.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, I don't know. As a man, I think I would be a little wary to be involved with a woman whose former boyfriend or husband disappeared. Maybe I would. Right. Haven't had that happen to me yet, not to my knowledge. We were talking, of course, about your father and how he's dealt with this. Very difficult, especially being that he lives right there, right beside the property. How about you? You like you said, you're solely responsible for this. You've been, I know, on another popular missing persons program. I'm going to say maybe 2016, maybe a couple years ago that you and Marissa did an interview.
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. And you said that you were into it for a while. You had to get away from it because maybe it was overtaking your life. How are you handling it now? How much space and time and effort does it take up in your life now?
Well, like I said, it's always there. I just try not to dwell on certain things, you know, as far as like law enforcement, because I know that's just a dead end. I just try my best to keep the awareness out there to let people know that he is still missing. Occasionally, you know, I get people private message me with a person's picture or somebody's that's been found somewhere, they'll think it may possibly be my brother, so at least I know people are paying attention, and it's still, in their memory banks to a degree too.
Okay.
So I have a Facebook page.
Yeah, let's talk about that. You said you put this billboard up on social media, on the internet. Do you have a Facebook page? What else? Anything else? And
That's
maybe.
all I have. I just,
Okay.
I could only afford to do the billboard for 3 months, and I put it up in Polk County because that's where she lives and all of her family. And the funny thing about that is where they put the billboard, her nephew worked in the auto parts store right next to where the billboard was put. So he got to
Nicely done, Lydia. Nicely done.
So anyways, I've done that. I've done as much news media as I can do. I'm to a point to where, there's nothing new. So obviously they're not going to do anything. Done the other podcast now with you, and I appreciate that. And I just, try to keep his flyer circulating. People share it. I'm involved, well, I shouldn't say involved, but I'm linked to several missing person agencies through Facebook, and they share it and put it out there as well. So, right now that's just where I'm at, as sad as it is.
Okay. I don't have this in the outline, but we should note that the husband that Vicky had before Robert, he died of a heart attack. Is that correct?
I think he had, as best as I can remember, I think he had heart issues. And, he died, I'm going to say, somewhere around 2006 to 2008, somewhere in that time frame. He lived in Missouri.
Okay, so they got divorced, and he died after they weren't married anymore.
Yes, she's been divorced from him for years. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to put this right out there. Have you ever had a chance to talk to anybody in his family about Vicky?
No, I don't know anything about him whatsoever, no.
Okay. All right, just wondered. Any final thoughts before we complete this interview, Lydia?
All I can think of is, it's just important to keep the awareness out there for all missing people. And I think these podcasts are great because they're a way for families to, get their story out there. And I think it's just a great relief to be able to tell your story.
And I enjoy doing it. I enjoy having all the people. As everybody knows, Unfound is an interview-based program. So 99% of the time I'm talking to family members like yourself.
Right.
And I let you, the guest, tell your story. And because I know that, for example, on TV shows like Disappeared, they'll interview you for 3 hours and only use 10 minutes.
Right.
And of course, that's not what we do here. Maybe you should give out that Facebook page, the name of it one more time for the listeners.
It's Missing Robert Wayne Cox.
Okay, and I will be linking to that, of course, in the group and on my page. By the time everybody listens to this interview, they'll know all about it. Lydia, I deeply appreciate you being on this episode of Unfound.
And I appreciate you.
Thank you.
And that was my interview with Lydia Carter, sister of Robert Cox. I thank her for joining me and all of you on this episode. I think it's appropriate that before I analyze this case, I should briefly discuss what Lydia's father, Vicky, and Brian were going through in the 3 years before Robert disappeared. It couldn't have been easy to watch a healthy guy like Robert go downhill so fast. I'm sure none of them expected it. Not to mention that the doctors didn't seem to have any permanent fixes for Robert's depression and anxiety, and no temporary solutions for his dropped head and other physical problems. In fact, to this day, nobody knows why the issues with Robert's body started. Was it a disease? Possibly. Could it have been a result of exposure to chemicals he encountered during his work in the oil and gas industry? That's possible too. A genetic disorder? I guess would have to put that on the list as well. But I will reiterate, as I said in the interview, that there is nothing I see in this case to believe anybody was intentionally causing Robert's physical and mental states to degrade. Nothing. I believe everyone in Robert's close circle was an innocent and helpless bystander. I think if they could have done something to fix him, they would have. This was not a murder 3 years in the making, unlike the poison case I cited from Pittsburgh. There are no facts to support that. Then, what are the facts? Well, the most glaring one that no one can ignore is there is no way Robert could have evaded all of the searchers who looked for him for the 48 hours after that Saturday morning. I'm usually very critical of how searches are conducted and who is doing them and how extensive they are or aren't. But I can't say that in this case. Yes, I know, there are several instances of missing persons cases where people search for a man or woman in a forest or in a town or in a swamp and nothing was originally found. Then 6 months later, 2 years later, 10 years later, the person's remains are found in the exact area where people were looking. Brian Barton, for example, found a mile away from his house on church property. For 12 years, he was literally feet away from parishioners parking their cars there every Sunday. But there were no smells, no birds flying overhead, no sightings of Brian in that area at the time of his disappearance. There is no question these kinds of things happen. But my belief is that if you look at those cases like Brian Barton's, where a person walks off and then is found many years later, the time the person went missing is inexact, so the original search was a guessing game. Or the person was able-bodied and could walk or run anywhere. Or the circumstances of the case add complexity to the case itself. The person was into drugs, somebody had a vendetta against the missing person, the person talked about running away. All of these points add a lot of wiggle room to any search that would be done in cases where a person is believed to have walked off. But in Robert's disappearance, it's all the opposite. We know the time that Robert disappeared due to Vicky, her daughter and granddaughter, because they were all there at the time. We know he couldn't walk very far, according to many people. We know Robert wasn't in trouble with anyone because he couldn't communicate and hadn't been out of the house by himself in at least 6 months. Yet, he's still missing. So to me, it's fairly clear-cut. One of the above 3 just mentioned facts about Robert's disappearance must be untrue. Either he didn't leave at the time Vicky said, and she didn't see him out there, or Robert was faking the whole time and could walk just fine, or somebody was after him and took advantage on that Saturday to snatch him before Vicky could find him in her car. With that, I'll leave the rest of the theorizing up to you. And that's the program. If you found it informative, please go to the app that you use to listen to Unfound and give this podcast a nice review. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Densel, and you've been listening to Unfound.